Der Führer's face. When animation became a weapon against tyranny. In 1943, Walt Disney Studios released what would become one of the most powerful pieces of anti-Nazi propaganda ever created. Der Führer's face, starring Donald Duck, wasn't just entertainment, it was warfare by animation, a systematic deconstruction of fascist ideology using humor as a scalpel and satire as a sword. This 8-minute cartoon would win an Academy Award, be temporarily banned in Russia decades later, and demonstrate something profound about the nature of power, propaganda, and resistance. But to understand why this cartoon matters, we need to understand the context in which it was created and the philosophy of resistance it represents. Because Der Führer's face isn't just about Donald Duck having a nightmare. It's about how democratic societies fight back against authoritarian control, how humor can undermine the most serious threats to human dignity, and why laughter might be the most dangerous weapon against tyranny. The year 1943 was a turning point in World War II. The United States had been in the war for over a year following Pearl Harbor. The Holocaust was reaching its most systematic and deadly phase. Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe, and the outcome of the war was far from certain. In this context, every cultural institution was mobilized for the war effort, including Hollywood and specifically Walt Disney Studios. Disney during wartime wasn't the family-friendly entertainment empire we know today. It was a propaganda machine, creating training films for the military, educational content for civilians, and morale-boosting entertainment for a nation at war. But Der Führer's face was different. It wasn't just supporting the war effort, it was actively deconstructing the enemy's ideology, exposing the absurdity at the heart of fascist power structures. The cartoon opens with a marching song that immediately establishes its satirical intent. The lyrics mock Nazi symbols, leaders, and ideology, with a childish, almost playground-level humor that makes fascism seem ridiculous rather than threatening. This wasn't accidental. The creators understood something crucial about authoritarian power. It depends on being taken seriously. Dictators require respect, fear, and reverence. Strip that away and the entire structure becomes vulnerable. This connects to broader patterns we see throughout history. When we examine the great empires and their leaders, we find that those who lasted understood the importance of narrative control. Napoleon mastered the art of shaping perception. The British Empire under Queen Victoria ruled through ceremonial distance and symbolic power. Even brutal leaders like Shaka Zulu or Genghis Khan understood that fear alone wasn't enough. They needed to create systems of meaning that justified their authority. But Der Führer's face does the opposite. It strips away the ceremony, the symbols, the manufactured dignity of Nazi ideology and reveals what lies beneath: petty men drunk on power, systems built on absurdity, and a worldview so fundamentally hollow that it cannot survive honest examination. The cartoon's genius lies in its approach to Donald Duck's character. Disney's animators didn't create a heroic resistance fighter or a noble patriot. They created a victim, an ordinary citizen trapped in a totalitarian system, forced to participate in rituals he doesn't understand, working in conditions that drain his humanity, living in constant surveillance and fear. This was far more effective than any heroic narrative, because it showed audiences what life under fascism actually looked like for regular people. Donald wakes up in Nazi Germany, forced to salute portraits of Hitler, Göring, and Goebbels, while a voice barks orders at him. He's rushed through a breakfast of stale bread and coffee made from a single bean, then marched to a factory where he's forced to work as a mindless cog in the war machine, screwing caps on artillery shells for hours on end. The pace accelerates until Donald has a nervous breakdown, and he wakes up to discover it was all a nightmare, safe in his American bedroom with the Statue of Liberty visible through his window. This structure reveals something profound about the nature of authoritarian systems. They don't just control through violence, though violence is always present. They control through exhaustion, through overwhelming citizens with demands for constant loyalty, through making life so regimented and surveilled that independent thought becomes impossible. The cartoon shows how totalitarian systems turn humans into machines, how they drain the joy and spontaneity that makes life worth living. But the most subversive element of Der Führer's face isn't its criticism of Nazi Germany, it's its implicit celebration of democratic values through contrast. When Donald wakes up in America, he doesn't salute a political leader. He hugs a miniature Statue of Liberty. The symbol isn't a person but an ideal, liberty itself. This reflects a fundamentally different philosophy of power, one where authority comes from consent rather than force, where symbols represent principles rather than personalities. This connects to historical patterns we see in successful empires and failed ones. Leaders like Cyrus of Persia built lasting empires by respecting local customs and allowing diversity within unity. Marcus Aurelius strengthened Rome by governing through philosophy rather than fear. Suleiman the Magnificent created stability through law rather than personality. In contrast, systems built purely on force and personality, like those of many fascist movements, tend to be brittle, dependent on constant success, and unable to adapt to changing circumstances. The cartoon also demonstrates the power of cultural resistance. During World War II, Nazi Germany had sophisticated propaganda machinery. They understood the importance of narrative, symbol, and emotional manipulation. Joseph Goebbels was a master of media manipulation, using film, radio, and mass rallies to create a sense of inevitable victory and historical destiny. Against this machinery of persuasion, democratic societies needed their own cultural weapons. Der Führer's face represents a different approach to propaganda, one that relies on truth rather than lies, humor rather than hatred, complexity rather than simplification. Where Nazi propaganda painted enemies as subhuman and portrayed conflict as a cosmic battle between good and evil, Disney's cartoon presented Nazis as buffoons and fascism as a system so absurd that it could only survive through force and fear. This approach reveals something important about democratic resilience. Authoritarian systems often appear strong because they can mobilize quickly, suppress dissent, and present a unified front. But this apparent strength masks underlying weaknesses. Systems that cannot tolerate criticism, that require constant validation, that depend on the infallibility of leaders are inherently fragile. Democratic societies, for all their messiness and inefficiency, have a crucial advantage. They can acknowledge their problems, adapt to new circumstances, and draw strength from diversity rather than uniformity. The timing of the cartoon's creation is also significant. By 1943, the tide of war was beginning to turn, but victory was far from assured. The cartoon served multiple purposes. It boosted morale among American audiences, it provided a framework for understanding what the war was really about, and it demonstrated that democratic societies could fight back culturally as well as militarily. But perhaps most importantly, it showed that humor could be a form of resistance. Totalitarian systems typically struggle with comedy because humor requires a certain freedom of thought, an ability to see incongruity and absurdity that authoritarian ideologies try to suppress. When people can laugh at their leaders, those leaders lose some of their power. When people can see the ridiculous aspects of supposedly sacred systems, those systems become vulnerable to criticism and change. This is why humor is often one of the first casualties of authoritarian rule. Comedians are arrested, satirical publications are shut down, and jokes about leaders become criminal offenses. The fact that Russia temporarily banned Der Führer's face decades after its creation suggests that its message still has power, that it still poses a threat to systems that depend on being taken too seriously. The cartoon's animation style reinforces its message. Disney's animators used exaggerated cartoonish depictions of Nazi leaders and symbols, making them appear grotesque and ridiculous rather than threatening. The contrast between the nightmarish Nazi sequences and the peaceful American ending is stark. The Nazi portions are angular, harsh, and mechanistic, while the American sequence is soft, organic, and human. This visual language reflects deeper philosophical differences about human nature and social organization. Fascist ideology tends to view humans as raw material to be shaped by the state, as components in a larger machine designed to serve the leader's vision. Democratic ideology, by contrast, sees government as serving human needs, protecting individual dignity while enabling collective action. The factory sequence in Der Führer's face is particularly effective because it shows how totalitarian systems dehumanize both workers and the work they do. Donald is forced to work at an inhuman pace, screwing caps on artillery shells while portraits of Nazi leaders watch him. The work is mindless, repetitive, and directed toward destruction rather than creation. This wasn't just criticism of Nazi Germany, it was a broader commentary on any system that treats humans as expendable resources. But the cartoon also reveals something about American wartime psychology. The ending, where Donald wakes up safe in America, reflects a certain confidence about democratic resilience that may seem naive today. The cartoon was created when American civilians felt relatively secure, when the war was something happening elsewhere, when the American homeland seemed safely protected by geography and military power. This context helps explain both the cartoon's effectiveness and its limitations. For American audiences in 1943, the Nazi threat was real but distant. They could laugh at Hitler because he wasn't directly threatening their daily lives. This psychological distance allowed for the kind of satirical treatment that might have been impossible for people living under actual occupation or threat. Yet the cartoon's core message transcends its specific historical context. It demonstrates how democratic societies can use their cultural tools, creativity, humor, free expression, to resist authoritarian threats. It shows how satire can expose the hollowness at the heart of systems that demand unquestioning obedience, and it suggests that laughter might be one of the most powerful weapons against tyranny. The Academy Award win for Der Führer's face was significant, not just as recognition of artistic achievement, but as validation of animation as a serious medium for political commentary. In 1943, cartoons were still largely viewed as children's entertainment or comic relief. The Oscar demonstrated that animation could address serious subjects, that it could serve important social and political functions beyond mere entertainment. This recognition reflected broader changes in how democratic societies approached cultural mobilization during wartime. Every art form, from Hollywood films to popular music to comic books, was enlisted in the war effort. But the most effective propaganda wasn't heavy-handed messaging. It was content that entertained while it persuaded, that made audiences feel good about their cause while exposing the weaknesses of their enemies. Der Führer's Face achieved this balance perfectly. It never feels like a lecture or a sermon. Instead, it uses Donald Duck's familiar character and Disney's polished animation to create an experience that's genuinely entertaining while delivering a powerful political message. The cartoon works because it doesn't ask audiences to set aside their desire for entertainment in favor of political education. It provides both simultaneously. The cartoon's treatment of Nazi ideology is particularly sophisticated. Rather than simply demonizing individual leaders, it exposes the systemic absurdities of fascist thinking, the obsession with ritual, the demand for constant displays of loyalty, the reduction of complex issues to simple slogans, the worship of leadership rather than principles. All of these elements are satirized in ways that reveal their fundamental emptiness. This approach reflects a deeper understanding of how authoritarian systems actually work. They don't typically succeed by convincing people that evil is good. Instead, they succeed by making participation easier than resistance, by overwhelming people with demands for compliance, by creating systems where independent thought becomes practically impossible rather than merely forbidden. The factory sequence demonstrates this perfectly. Donald isn't forced to believe in Nazi ideology, he's simply forced to participate in its machinery. The system doesn't require his genuine enthusiasm, just his mechanical compliance. This insight about totalitarian control, that it often operates through exhaustion and routine rather than conviction, was remarkably sophisticated for a cartoon created in 1943. The contrast with Donald's American awakening is equally revealing. He doesn't wake up to propaganda about American superiority or demands for patriotic display. Instead, he wakes up to symbols of freedom and self-determination. The miniature Statue of Liberty represents an ideal rather than a person, a principle rather than a personality. This reflects a fundamentally different philosophy of governance, one where political authority serves human dignity rather than demanding its sacrifice. But the cartoon also reveals the limitations of American wartime thinking. The ending suggests a clear moral distinction between American democracy and Nazi fascism, that while largely accurate may have oversimplified the complexities of both systems. The cartoon was created during a period when American confidence in democratic institutions was high, before the revelations about Japanese-American internment, before the full extent of Jim Crow segregation became widely acknowledged, before the moral ambiguities of the Cold War era. This doesn't invalidate the cartoon's message, but it does remind us that all cultural products reflect the limitations as well as the insights of their historical moment. Der Führer's Face was effective because it captured something true about the differences between democratic and authoritarian systems, but it may have underestimated the ongoing work required to maintain democratic values even within democratic societies. The cartoon's ban in Russia decades later speaks to its enduring power and relevance. The fact that a World War II-era Disney cartoon could be seen as threatening to a modern authoritarian system suggests that its insights about power, propaganda, and resistance remain applicable. Authoritarian leaders in any era seem to recognize the danger of being laughed at, the vulnerability of systems that demand to be taken seriously. This pattern appears throughout history. Successful authoritarian leaders typically try to control not just political opposition but cultural expression, recognizing that art, literature, music, and comedy can undermine political control in ways that direct political challenge cannot. The ability to satirize power, to expose its pretensions and absurdities, represents a form of freedom that authoritarian systems cannot tolerate. But Der Führer's Face also demonstrates the responsibility that comes with this cultural freedom. The cartoon's creators didn't simply use their platform for personal expression. They recognized that in wartime, cultural tools could serve larger purposes, that entertainment could be enlisted in the defense of human dignity and democratic values. This raises important questions about the role of artists and entertainers in times of political crisis. How do democratic societies mobilize cultural resources without compromising artistic freedom? How do creators balance personal expression with social responsibility? How do we distinguish between legitimate cultural resistance and mere propaganda? Der Führer's Face suggests some answers to these questions. The cartoon works because it's genuinely entertaining, because it respects its audience's intelligence, because it uses humor to reveal truth rather than obscure it. It succeeds as propaganda precisely because it doesn't feel like propaganda. It feels like honest artistic expression that happens to serve important political purposes. The cartoon's legacy extends far beyond its immediate wartime context. It demonstrated that animation could address serious subjects, that humor could be a form of political resistance, that entertainment could serve democratic values without sacrificing artistic quality. These insights helped pave the way for later developments in political satire, from Saturday Night Live to The Daily Show to countless internet memes that use humor to expose political absurdity.
but perhaps the cartoon's most important legacy is its demonstration that democratic societies possess cultural tools that authoritarian systems cannot match. The ability to criticize, to satirize, to laugh at power represents a form of strength that doesn't appear on any military balance sheet, but may be decisive in long-term struggles between different forms of social organization. The temporary ban of Der Führer's face in Russia reminds us that this struggle continues. Authoritarian systems still recognize the power of satirical criticism, still fear the corrosive effect of laughter on political authority, still try to control cultural expression in ways that reveal their underlying weakness and insecurity. In our current era of global political tension, rising authoritarianism, and competing narratives about democracy and freedom, Der Führer's face offers both inspiration and warning. It shows how cultural tools can serve democratic resistance, but it also reminds us that this resistance requires ongoing effort, creativity, and courage. The cartoon's 8-minute runtime contains layers of meaning that continue to reward analysis decades after its creation. It serves as both historical artifact and contemporary guide, both entertainment and education, both artistic achievement and political statement. In the end, Der Führer's face proves that sometimes the most powerful weapons against tyranny are not tanks or bombs, but pencils and paper, creativity and humor, the simple but revolutionary act of refusing to take authoritarianism seriously. As we face our own challenges to democratic values and human dignity, we might remember Donald Duck's nightmare and awakening, and ask ourselves, what cultural tools do we possess? How can we use creativity to resist authoritarianism? And what would our own awakening from nightmare look like? The answers may determine not just the fate of particular political systems, but the future of human freedom itself.
Family Guy, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, the comedy that crossed the line. In 2000, Family Guy created what would become one of the most controversial episodes in animated television history. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was banned from broadcast for 3 years, pulled from syndication, and sparked debates about the boundaries of satirical comedy that continue to this day. But this isn't just a story about offensive humor or network censorship. It's a case study in how modern democratic societies navigate the tension between free expression and cultural sensitivity, how entertainment reflects and shapes social attitudes, and why the mechanisms of cultural control in open societies can be more complex and nuanced than the crude censorship of authoritarian regimes. To understand why this episode matters beyond its immediate controversy, we need to examine it through the lens of power dynamics, cultural representation, and the evolving relationship between creators, networks, and audiences in democratic media systems. Because When You Wish Upon a Weinstein reveals something profound about how cultural boundaries are negotiated in free societies, how stereotypes function as tools of both inclusion and exclusion, and how the very freedom that allows provocative content also enables the backlash that can suppress it. The episode centers on Peter Griffin's financial troubles and his belief that having a Jewish accountant will solve his problems. This premise immediately establishes the satirical target, not Jewish people themselves, but the stereotype that associates Jewish identity with financial acumen. The show's creator, Seth MacFarlane, has consistently argued that the episode satirizes anti-Semitic stereotypes rather than reinforcing them, using Peter's ignorance as a vehicle for exposing the absurdity of such thinking. This defense reveals a fundamental challenge in satirical comedy, the gap between authorial intent and audience interpretation. MacFarlane's approach mirrors techniques used throughout history by satirists who claim to expose rather than endorse the prejudices they depict. But as we see in historical patterns of cultural representation, this strategy carries inherent risks. When Jonathan Swift wrote A Modest Proposal, suggesting that the Irish poor sell their children as food, he trusted his audience to recognize the satire. When Charlie Chaplin parodied Hitler in The Great Dictator, he assumed viewers would understand the critique. But satirical intent doesn't guarantee satirical reception. The episode's production and initial suppression illuminate the complex power structures within modern media conglomerates. Fox initially aired the episode but quickly pulled it from reruns after complaints from the Anti-Defamation League and other Jewish advocacy groups. This wasn't government censorship in the traditional sense. There were no laws broken, no state officials demanding removal. Instead, it was corporate self-regulation in response to organized pressure from advocacy groups representing communities with significant cultural and economic influence. This pattern reflects a broader shift in how democratic societies manage cultural content. Unlike authoritarian systems that rely on state censorship and legal prohibition, democratic media systems operate through a complex web of corporate interests, advertiser pressure, audience feedback, and advocacy group influence. The result is a form of soft censorship that can be more effective than government bans precisely because it appears voluntary and market-driven, rather than imposed from above. The mechanism that suppressed When You Wish Upon a Weinstein shares characteristics with historical patterns of cultural control, but operates through different structures. In imperial systems, cultural content was typically controlled by royal decree or religious authority. The Roman Empire managed cultural expression through patronage and punishment. Medieval European monarchs controlled cultural production through the church and court systems. Even democratic societies have used legal censorship during wartime or periods of social tension. But the Family Guy case represents something different: the power of organized advocacy to influence corporate decision-making in ways that can effectively suppress content without legal intervention. This system has advantages. It allows for community input and cultural sensitivity without government overreach. But it also has disadvantages. It can create chilling effects on creative expression and give disproportionate influence to well-organized groups while silencing less organized voices. The episode's content itself reveals the complexity of contemporary cultural representation. Peter's search for a Jewish accountant is portrayed as ignorant and stereotypical, but the stereotype is also validated when the Jewish character, Max Weinstein, does indeed prove financially competent. This creates a satirical paradox. The show simultaneously mocks anti-Semitic stereotypes and reinforces them, criticizes Peter's prejudices while confirming their basis in the fictional world of the show. This paradox reflects broader challenges in contemporary comedy writing. In an era of increased sensitivity to representation and historical trauma, satirists face the difficult task of engaging with sensitive topics without perpetuating harm. The traditional satirical strategy of using character ignorance to expose audience prejudices becomes more problematic when audiences are fragmented, when cultural knowledge varies widely, and when the potential for misinterpretation carries real social consequences. The episode's treatment of Jewish identity also reveals assumptions about cultural power and vulnerability that shaped both its creation and reception. The satirical approach assumes that Jewish Americans are sufficiently integrated and empowered to be appropriate targets for gentle mockery, similar to how established ethnic groups like Irish or Italian Americans are routinely satirized in American comedy. But critics argued that anti-Semitic stereotypes carry unique historical weight due to the Holocaust and ongoing anti-Semitism, making such satirical treatment inappropriate regardless of intent. This debate reflects larger questions about how democratic societies should handle the legacy of historical persecution. Should groups that have experienced systematic oppression be protected from satirical treatment? How do we balance historical sensitivity with contemporary integration? When does protective treatment become patronizing? These questions don't have easy answers, and different democratic societies have reached different conclusions. The 3-year ban of the episode also demonstrates how cultural controversies evolve over time. By 2003, when Fox finally aired the episode, the immediate controversy had subsided, but the cultural context had also shifted. The post-September 11th climate had changed discussions about minority representation, religious sensitivity, and cultural tolerance. The episode that seemed too provocative in 2000 appeared less threatening in 2003, suggesting that cultural boundaries are not fixed but constantly renegotiated. This temporal dimension of cultural censorship reveals important insights about how democratic societies manage controversial content. Unlike authoritarian bans that are typically permanent and backed by state power, democratic cultural suppression is often temporary and subject to changing circumstances. Content that is unacceptable at one moment may become acceptable later as social attitudes evolve, advocacy pressures shift, or public attention moves elsewhere. The episode's eventual release also demonstrates the limits of soft censorship in democratic systems. Unlike state censorship that can permanently suppress content, corporate and advocacy pressure operates within market systems that ultimately respond to consumer demand. The episode's eventual broadcast, its availability on streaming platforms, and its continued discussion in media criticism all suggest that democratic censorship, while real, is rarely total or permanent, but the case also reveals the uneven effects of cultural advocacy. The organized response from Jewish advocacy groups was swift and effective, leading to the episode's removal within weeks of its initial broadcast. This success reflected the organizational capacity, cultural influence, and economic leverage of established Jewish American institutions. Other groups facing satirical treatment in Family Guy episodes, including various ethnic minorities, religious groups, and social categories, have not always achieved similar responses to their concerns. This disparity highlights important questions about cultural democracy and representation. Should the effectiveness of advocacy determine the boundaries of acceptable satirical content? How do democratic societies ensure that all groups have equal voice in cultural debates? What happens when advocacy power correlates with existing social and economic advantages, potentially amplifying the voices of already powerful groups while marginalizing others? The episode's treatment of stereotypes also reveals the complex relationship between representation and reality in contemporary comedy. The financial competence stereotype about Jewish Americans, while problematic, does correlate with statistical realities about educational achievement, professional success, and economic mobility within Jewish American communities. This creates a difficult situation for satirists. Engaging with social realities risks reinforcing stereotypes, while ignoring them risks irrelevance. This challenge reflects broader tensions in democratic discourse about group differences. Liberal democratic ideology emphasizes individual merit and universal equality, but social reality includes persistent group-based patterns in achievement, behavior, and cultural values.
Comedy often thrives on observing and exaggerating these patterns, but doing so risks essentializing group identities and reinforcing social hierarchies. The Family Guy case also illuminates the role of media corporations as cultural gatekeepers in democratic societies. Fox's decision to pull and later air the episode was not made by government officials or legal authorities, but by corporate executives responding to various pressures and incentives. This privatization of cultural control has both democratic and anti-democratic implications. On the democratic side, corporate control allows for market-based cultural regulation that responds to consumer preferences and community values, without requiring government intervention. Advocacy groups can organize pressure campaigns, advertisers can withdraw support, and audiences can express preferences through viewing choices. This creates a form of cultural democracy where community voices can influence content decisions. On the anti-democratic side, corporate control concentrates cultural power in the hands of business executives who are accountable primarily to shareholders rather than democratic constituencies. Their decisions may prioritize profit over artistic expression, advertiser comfort over creative risk-taking, or the preferences of organized advocacy groups over broader public opinion. This can create cultural oligarchy disguised as market freedom. The episode's satirical strategy also reveals important assumptions about audience sophistication and cultural literacy. McFarlane's defense assumes that viewers can distinguish between character ignorance and authorial endorsement, that audiences understand satirical conventions, and that viewers share sufficient cultural knowledge to recognize the critique embedded in the stereotype. But these assumptions may not hold across diverse democratic audiences. This challenge reflects broader questions about cultural communication in pluralistic societies. When audiences include people from different educational backgrounds, cultural traditions, and historical experiences, satirical strategies that work for some viewers may fail or backfire with others. Democratic media must somehow address this diversity while maintaining coherent artistic vision. The global dimension of the controversy also reveals how local cultural sensitivities interact with international media distribution. While the episode was created for American audiences within American cultural contexts, Family Guy's international distribution meant that it reached audiences with different historical experiences, cultural knowledge, and satirical traditions. Content that might be acceptable within one democratic culture may be problematic within others. This globalization of cultural content creates new challenges for democratic media regulation. Should satirical content be judged by the standards of its country of origin or its countries of distribution? How do democratic societies handle cultural products that cross international boundaries? What happens when democratic values themselves are interpreted differently across democratic societies? The episode's long-term impact on Family Guy itself demonstrates how cultural controversies can shape creative development. The intense criticism and corporate response to When You Wish Upon a Weinstein appears to have influenced the show's subsequent approach to satirical content. While Family Guy has continued to push boundaries in court controversy, the specific strategy of satirizing ethnic stereotypes through character ignorance has been used more carefully. This evolution suggests that soft censorship can be more effective than legal prohibition in shaping creative behavior. Rather than simply suppressing specific content, advocacy pressure and corporate response can influence the development of satirical strategies, encouraging creators to find different approaches to controversial topics. This may produce more culturally sensitive content, but it may also create self-censorship that limits creative exploration. The case also reveals the important role of timing in cultural controversies. The episode was produced during a period when Family Guy was establishing its satirical identity and pushing against traditional network television boundaries. The intense response to this particular episode occurred at a moment when the show was still defining its relationship with audiences, advertisers, and advocacy groups. A similar episode produced later in the show's run, when its satirical approach was better established, might have generated less controversy. This temporal dimension suggests that cultural boundaries are not just socially negotiated but also historically contingent. The same content may be received differently depending on when it appears, what other cultural conversations are occurring simultaneously, and how established the creator's satirical reputation happens to be. Democratic societies must somehow account for these temporal factors, while maintaining consistent principles about expression and representation. The episode's treatment of financial themes also reflects broader cultural anxieties about economic inequality and social mobility in contemporary America. Peter's financial troubles and his belief that ethnic networking provides unfair advantages touch on real tensions about economic opportunity, cultural capital, and social stratification. The satirical treatment of these themes occurs within a larger cultural conversation about fairness, merit, and group advantages that goes far beyond entertainment. This connection between satirical content and social reality reveals another challenge for democratic media regulation. Comedy often derives its power from engaging with real social tensions and anxieties. Suppressing such engagement may reduce potentially offensive content, but it may also limit comedy's capacity to process and comment on important social issues. Democratic societies must somehow balance cultural sensitivity with the social functions that satirical entertainment serves. The advocacy response to the episode also demonstrates the professionalization of cultural criticism in contemporary democratic societies. The organized campaigns against the episode were not spontaneous expressions of community outrage, but carefully coordinated efforts by established advocacy organizations with media expertise, legal knowledge, and corporate contacts. This professionalization can make advocacy more effective, but may also create disparities between groups with professional advocacy capacity and those without. The episode's eventual availability through streaming services and digital distribution reveals how technological change affects cultural censorship in democratic societies. While traditional broadcast networks remain subject to advertiser pressure and advocacy campaigns, digital platforms operate under different economic models and regulatory frameworks. Content that is suppressed from broadcast television may find alternative distribution channels that reach different audiences under different conditions. This technological dimension of cultural access suggests that democratic censorship may become increasingly complex and fragmented as media systems diversify. Rather than unified cultural boundaries enforced across all platforms, we may see different standards applied to different distribution systems, creating a layered approach to cultural regulation that varies by technology, audience, and economic model. The ongoing discussion of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein in media criticism and cultural studies also reveals how controversial content can gain academic and critical attention that extends its influence beyond its original entertainment context. The episode has become a case study in satirical ethics, democratic censorship, and cultural representation that reaches audiences who may never have seen the original broadcast. This academic afterlife can give controversial content continued relevance and influence even when it is suppressed from popular distribution. Looking at this case through the analytical framework we use for historical empires and leadership reveals interesting parallels and contrasts. Like the great rulers who understood the importance of narrative control, modern media creators like McFarlane attempt to shape cultural conversations through satirical content. But unlike imperial leaders who could impose their narratives through force or institutional authority, democratic satirists must navigate complex systems of corporate control, advocacy pressure, and audience response. The soft censorship that suppressed this episode resembles the nuanced cultural control exercised by leaders like Catherine the Great, who managed cultural expression through patronage and pressure rather than crude prohibition. But it also differs fundamentally because it operates through civil society institutions rather than state power, creating a form of cultural regulation that is both more democratic and potentially more restrictive than traditional censorship. The case ultimately demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of democratic approaches to cultural conflict. The system allowed for community voice, corporate response, and eventual accommodation that satisfied multiple stakeholders. But it also revealed how organized advocacy can effectively suppress content, how corporate interests can override artistic expression, and how cultural boundaries are negotiated through power dynamics rather than principled debate. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein remains a fascinating case study in how democratic societies manage the tension between free expression and cultural sensitivity. It reveals the complex mechanisms through which cultural boundaries are established and maintained in open societies, the role of advocacy and corporate power in shaping cultural content, and the ongoing challenges of satirical representation in pluralistic democracies. The episode's controversial legacy continues to inform debates about comedy, representation, and cultural democracy that will likely persist as long as diverse societies struggle to balance freedom with sensitivity, expression with respect, and artistic license with social responsibility.
The Adventures of Mark Twain, When Children's Cinema Confronted Ultimate Nihilism. In 1985, a children's film did something unprecedented in the history of family entertainment. The Adventures of Mark Twain included a sequence so philosophically dark, so existentially terrifying, that it traumatized an entire generation of young viewers. The Satan scene, adapted from Mark Twain's The Mysterious Stranger, presented children with a vision of cosmic meaninglessness that challenged every assumption about childhood innocence, divine purpose, and human significance. This wasn't simply inappropriate content mistakenly included in family entertainment. It was a deliberate artistic choice that revealed something profound about power, creation, destruction, and the philosophical foundations of human civilization. To understand why this scene matters beyond its immediate shock value, we must examine it through the lens of power philosophy, examining how different rulers and civilizations have grappled with questions of meaning, purpose, and the relationship between creation and destruction. Because the Satan figure in this scene embodies a particular philosophy of power that stands in stark contrast to every imperial model we see throughout history, and his message represents perhaps the most radical challenge to human civilization ever presented in popular culture. The scene occurs when Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and Becky Thatcher encounter Satan, who appears as a charming youthful figure with otherworldly powers. Satan creates a miniature civilization before their eyes, complete with tiny people living their lives, building structures, forming relationships, and developing culture. The children are delighted by this display of creative power, marveling at the intricate detail and apparent benevolence of this miniature world. But then Satan destroys it all with casual indifference, explaining that human life is meaningless, that moral distinctions are illusions, and that the universe itself is nothing more than a cosmic joke. This sequence operates on multiple levels of meaning that connect to fundamental questions about power, purpose, and human significance that have occupied rulers and philosophers throughout history. Unlike the empire builders we study, who sought to create lasting legacies, establish meaningful order, or serve transcendent purposes, Satan represents pure creative and destructive power, divorced from any moral framework or ultimate meaning. He is the anti-emperor, the negation of every attempt to build something lasting or significant. The philosophical content of the scene draws directly from Mark Twain's later, more pessimistic writings, particularly The Mysterious Stranger, which reflected his growing disillusionment with human nature and cosmic purpose. But presenting this material to children in 1985 represented a radical departure from established norms of family entertainment. Since the earliest days of children's literature and media, there had been an implicit understanding that young audiences should be protected from existential despair, that entertainment for children should affirm rather than challenge basic assumptions about meaning, morality, and hope. This protective approach reflects deeper patterns we see in how civilizations have traditionally handled questions of ultimate meaning. The great empires and their leaders typically provided their subjects with cosmic frameworks that justified earthly authority and suffering. The pharaohs of Egypt built their entire civilization around elaborate mythologies of divine order and eternal significance. The Roman Empire integrated diverse religious traditions, but always within frameworks that supported imperial authority and social cohesion. Medieval European monarchs ruled through Christian cosmology that promised ultimate justice and meaning even in the face of earthly suffering. Even secular imperial projects like those of Napoleon or the Soviet Union provided grand narratives of historical progress and human achievement that gave individual sacrifice meaning within larger purposeful frameworks. The most successful empires, from Cyrus of Persia to the British Empire under Victoria, understood that human beings require meaning and purpose to accept authority and endure hardship. They may have differed in their specific mythologies, but they all provided their subjects with reasons to believe that their lives mattered within larger cosmic or historical designs. The Satan figure in The Adventures of Mark Twain represents the complete negation of this imperial tradition. He possesses ultimate creative and destructive power but uses it without purpose, meaning, or moral framework. He creates not to build civilization or express divine will, but simply because he can. He destroys not to punish wrongdoing or clear space for something better, but out of casual indifference to the suffering he causes. He represents power as pure capability, divorced from any justifying narrative or moral purpose. This philosophical position poses a more fundamental challenge to human civilization than any military threat or political revolution. External enemies can be fought, defeated, or accommodated. Internal contradictions can be managed through reform or transformation. But a universe without inherent meaning or purpose challenges the very foundations upon which all human institutions rest. If Satan is correct that moral distinctions are illusions and human life is cosmically insignificant, then every empire, every law, every cultural achievement, every act of love or sacrifice becomes equally meaningless. The scene's presentation to children makes this philosophical challenge even more radical. Adults have developed various psychological and intellectual defenses against existential despair. They can retreat into religious faith, immerse themselves in daily responsibilities, find meaning in relationships and achievements, or simply avoid thinking about ultimate questions. But children lack these developed defense mechanisms. They approach philosophical questions with directness and intensity that can make abstract concepts feel immediate and personal. The traumatic impact reported by many viewers suggests that the scene succeeded in conveying its philosophical content with unusual effectiveness. Unlike typical children's entertainment that presents clear moral frameworks and reassuring conclusions, this sequence offered no comfort, no resolution, no protective distance from its disturbing implications. Children watching Satan destroy his miniature civilization were forced to confront questions about cosmic meaning and moral reality that most adult entertainment carefully avoids. This directness connects to patterns we see in how different rulers have handled ultimate questions about power and meaning. The most psychologically sophisticated leaders understood that their authority rested not just on force or institutional structure, but on their ability to provide their subjects with convincing answers to fundamental questions about purpose and significance. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about these questions in his private meditations,
ideals, developing stoic frameworks that could sustain him through the challenges of imperial responsibility. Ashoka transformed his entire approach to rule after confronting the moral implications of his conquests, seeking meaning through dharma and ethical governance. But the Satan figure represents a form of power that has abandoned any attempt to provide such frameworks. He doesn't rule through fear like a tyrant, or through inspiration like a charismatic leader, or through institutional authority like a constitutional monarch. He simply exists as pure power, creating and destroying without reference to any larger purpose or moral framework. This makes him perhaps the most terrifying figure in political philosophy, because he represents the possibility that all human attempts to create meaning and order are ultimately futile. The miniature civilization that Satan creates and destroys serves as a metaphor for all human achievement. The tiny people build their structures, develop their relationships, and pursue their goals with the same seriousness and intensity that characterizes human civilization at full scale. From their perspective, their lives have meaning, their achievements matter, their suffering deserves recognition. But from Satan's perspective, which represents the view from ultimate cosmic distance, all of this activity is equally insignificant. This perspective challenge connects to recurring themes in imperial philosophy about the relationship between individual significance and larger historical forces. The great empire builders typically had to navigate between acknowledging individual human dignity and treating people as expendable resources in service of larger projects. Cyrus of Persia built his empire through policies that respected local customs and individual communities, but still required massive taxation and military service from his subjects. Charlemagne promoted Christian values that emphasized individual souls while building an empire through conquest and forced conversion. The Satan figure eliminates this tension by denying that either individual significance or larger historical projects have any ultimate meaning. He doesn't balance competing claims about human value because he rejects the premise that such value exists. This philosophical position is logically coherent but psychologically devastating, particularly for children who haven't yet developed the intellectual frameworks necessary to grapple with such radical nihilism. The scene's artistic presentation compounds its philosophical impact through sophisticated clay animation that gives Satan's creative and destructive acts tangible visual reality. The miniature people aren't abstract concepts, but detailed figures whose destruction feels immediate and personal. The technical achievement of the animation makes the philosophical content more visceral and harder to dismiss as mere intellectual speculation. Children watching the scene see and hear the tiny people's distress as Satan casually ends their existence, making abstract questions about cosmic meaning feel emotionally immediate. This artistic choice reflects a broader pattern in how profound philosophical challenges have been presented throughout cultural history. The most effective critiques of established order typically combine intellectual content with emotional impact, using artistic techniques to make abstract ideas feel personally relevant. Voltaire's satirical attacks on religious and political authority worked because they used humor and narrative to make philosophical arguments emotionally engaging. The propaganda techniques developed by totalitarian movements succeeded because they combined ideological content with powerful visual and emotional appeals. But the Adventures of Mark Twain uses these techniques in service of a message that undermines rather than supports any particular political or social agenda. Unlike propaganda that seeks to channel philosophical uncertainty toward support for specific institutions or leaders, the Satan scene offers no alternative framework, no competing vision of meaning or purpose. It simply presents the possibility that all such frameworks are equally illusory. This approach connects to broader questions about the role of art and entertainment in maintaining social cohesion. Most cultural products, even those that criticize specific institutions or practices, operate within broader frameworks that affirm basic assumptions about human significance and moral reality. They may challenge particular rulers, question specific policies, or advocate for different approaches to social organization, but they rarely challenge the fundamental premises that make social organization meaningful in the first place. The Satan scene represents a rare example of popular culture that directly confronts these fundamental premises without offering reassuring alternatives. This makes it both artistically bold and socially dangerous, because it threatens the psychological foundations upon which social cooperation and individual motivation depend. If people truly accepted Satan's perspective on cosmic meaninglessness, it's unclear how human civilization could continue to function. The historical context of the film's production in 1985 adds another layer of significance to its philosophical content. The mid-1980s were a period of relative prosperity and confidence in American society, but also a time of underlying anxiety about nuclear warfare, environmental destruction, and cultural change. The Reagan-era's optimistic rhetoric about American greatness and traditional values coexisted with growing awareness of existential threats that could potentially end human civilization entirely. The Satan scene can be read as reflecting these deeper cultural anxieties about meaning and permanence in an age of unprecedented destructive capability. The casual ease with which Satan destroys his miniature civilization mirrors the contemporary reality that human civilization itself could be destroyed through nuclear warfare or environmental collapse with similar casualness. The philosophical nihilism of the scene reflects growing cultural uncertainty about whether human achievement and moral effort have any ultimate significance in the face of such possibilities. This historical dimension connects to patterns we see in how different civilizations have responded to existential threats and philosophical challenges. The most resilient empires typically developed cultural frameworks that could acknowledge uncertainty and suffering while maintaining basic commitments to meaning and purpose. The Roman Empire survived multiple crises by adapting its religious and philosophical foundations to changing circumstances. Chinese civilization persisted through repeated dynastic changes by maintaining cultural continuities that transcended particular political arrangements. But the modern era presents challenges that may be qualitatively different from historical precedents. The possibility of complete human extinction through nuclear warfare or environmental collapse creates forms of existential anxiety that previous civilizations never had to address. The scientific understanding of cosmic scale and temporal duration makes traditional religious and philosophical frameworks seem less psychologically adequate than they once did. The Satan scene can be understood as reflecting these distinctively modern forms of existential anxiety. The traumatic impact on child audiences also reveals important insights about the relationship between philosophical sophistication and psychological resilience. The children who were traumatized by the Satan scene weren't necessarily less intelligent or emotionally stable than those who weren't affected. In many cases, the most thoughtful and sensitive children may have been most disturbed by the scene's implications because they were most capable of understanding its philosophical content. This suggests important questions about how democratic societies should handle the transmission of challenging philosophical content to young audiences. The traditional approach of protecting children from existential despair assumes that they will gradually develop the intellectual and emotional resources necessary to confront ultimate questions as they mature. But this approach may also leave them unprepared for philosophical challenges that can arise suddenly through art, literature, or life experience. The scene's lasting cultural impact demonstrates how artistic works can shape generational consciousness in ways that extend far beyond their immediate entertainment value. Many viewers report that the Satan scene fundamentally altered their understanding of reality, introducing them to philosophical possibilities they had never previously considered. This influence operated independently of the viewer's later intellectual development or religious belief, suggesting that early exposure to radical philosophical challenges can have permanent psychological effects. This cultural transmission of philosophical content connects to broader patterns in how civilizations pass on their foundational assumptions across generations. Most educational and cultural institutions operate to transmit established frameworks of meaning and value rather than to challenge them. Children learn about history, literature, science, and ethics within contexts that generally affirm rather than question basic assumptions about human significance and moral reality. The Satan scene represents a rare breach in this protective cultural transmission, introducing children to philosophical possibilities that mainstream institutions typically avoid or postpone until later developmental stages. This makes it both an artistic achievement and a form of cultural transgression that challenges established boundaries between appropriate and inappropriate content for young audiences. The scene's adaptation from Mark Twain's writings also raises questions about the relationship between literary and visual media in conveying philosophical content. Twain's original Mysterious Stranger presented similar themes through narrative prose that allowed readers to maintain some psychological distance from its disturbing implications. Readers could process the philosophical content intellectually while using the medium of written language to buffer its emotional impact. The visual presentation in the film eliminates much of this protective distance by making the philosophical content immediately sensory and emotional. Children watching Satan destroy his miniature civilization see and hear the destruction in ways that make abstract questions about cosmic meaning feel personally threatening. This demonstrates how different artistic media can amplify or diminish the psychological impact of identical philosophical content. The scene's treatment of power also reveals important insights about the relationship between capability and responsibility that connect to broader questions about imperial authority and moral obligation. Throughout history, rulers with great power have typically justified their authority through claims about serving higher purposes, protecting their subjects, or advancing civilization. Even tyrants and conquerors have usually presented their actions within frameworks that acknowledge moral categories and ultimate purposes. Satan represents pure power without any such justifying framework. He creates and destroys not to serve any purpose or advance any goal, but simply because he possesses the capability to do so. This divorcing of power from purpose represents perhaps the most terrifying form of authority imaginable, because it offers no basis for appeal, negotiation, or moral engagement. This perspective on power challenges fundamental assumptions that underlie most political and ethical thinking. If power is simply capability divorced from moral purpose, then questions about justice, legitimacy, and responsibility become meaningless. The strong do what they can, not because it serves any good or advances any purpose, but simply because they can. This reduces all human relationships to pure power dynamics without moral or philosophical dimension. The children's reactions within the scene reflect different philosophical responses to this challenge. Some are horrified by Satan's casual destruction of his miniature civilization, responding with moral outrage that assumes the tiny people's lives have value regardless of their cosmic insignificance. Others are fascinated by Satan's power, attracted to the freedom from moral constraint that his perspective seems to offer. These different reactions mirror the range of philosophical responses to nihilistic challenges that we see throughout intellectual history. The scene's resolution, or lack thereof, is perhaps its most disturbing aspect. Unlike typical children's entertainment that provides clear moral lessons or reassuring conclusions, the Satan sequence ends without refuting its philosophical challenge, or offering alternative frameworks for meaning and purpose. The children are left to process the encounter on their own, without adult guidance or cultural support for understanding its implications. This lack of resolution reflects the genuine difficulty of responding to radical philosophical challenges about meaning and purpose. Unlike practical problems that can be solved through effort and ingenuity, existential questions about cosmic significance resist easy answers. The most honest artistic treatments of such questions often acknowledge this difficulty rather than providing false reassurance. But presenting such acknowledgement to child audiences raises important questions about the responsibilities of entertainment creators and cultural institutions. If art and entertainment serve important functions in helping young people develop psychological resilience and moral frameworks, then exposing them to philosophical challenges without providing adequate support for processing those challenges may be irresponsible regardless of artistic merit. The scene's continuing cultural relevance suggests that its philosophical content addresses enduring rather than merely contemporary concerns. New generations of viewers continue to discover and be affected by the Satan sequence, indicating that its themes about power, meaning, and cosmic significance remain psychologically compelling regardless of changing historical circumstances. This enduring relevance connects to broader patterns in how fundamental philosophical questions persist across different historical periods and cultural contexts. The specific forms that existential anxiety takes may vary with changing technology, social organization, and cultural knowledge, but the underlying questions about human significance and cosmic purpose remain constant. The Satan scene from The Adventures of Mark Twain represents a unique moment in cultural history, when sophisticated philosophical content was presented to child audiences without the protective frameworks that typically buffer such material. Its traumatic impact on many viewers demonstrates both the power of artistic media to convey philosophical ideas and the psychological risks involved in exposing young minds to radical challenges to meaning and purpose. Through the analytical framework we use for understanding imperial power and leadership, the Satan figure emerges as the ultimate anti-emperor, representing pure power divorced from any justifying purpose or moral framework. His casual creation and destruction of miniature civilization challenges every assumption about meaning, purpose, and value that underlies human social organization. The scene's lasting cultural impact suggests that it succeeded in its apparent goal of confronting viewers with fundamental questions about existence, morality, and cosmic significance. Whether this represents an artistic achievement or a form of cultural irresponsibility remains debatable, but its influence on generational consciousness is undeniable. As we continue to grapple with questions about meaning, purpose, and human significance in an age of unprecedented technological capability and existential risk, the Satan scene from The Adventures of Mark Twain remains a provocative and disturbing exploration of what it might mean to possess ultimate power without ultimate purpose. Its challenge to conventional assumptions about meaning and morality continues to resonate with new audiences, ensuring its place as one of the most philosophically radical sequences in the history of popular entertainment.
Kitchen Casanova, when a single scene defines cultural boundaries. In the landscape of media censorship, some bans emerge from systematic ideological conflicts, others from moral panic, and still others from political pressure. But occasionally, a piece of content is banned for reasons so specific, so seemingly minor, that it reveals something profound about how cultural boundaries are actually established and maintained in modern societies. Kitchen Casanova represents such a case, a production ban not for its overall themes, political content, or moral framework, but for a single scene depicting accidental self-injury that crossed invisible lines in the complex geography of acceptable entertainment. To understand why this matters beyond the immediate circumstances of one banned production, we must examine it through the lens of power dynamics, cultural control mechanisms, and the philosophy of content regulation that shapes what audiences can and cannot see. Because the banning of kitchen Casanova reveals important insights about how democratic societies establish and enforce cultural boundaries, how regulatory authority operates in entertainment industries, and why seemingly trivial content decisions can reflect deeper anxieties about representation, responsibility, and social influence. The specific scene that triggered the ban involved a character accidentally cutting their finger while cooking, presumably in a context meant to be comedic or dramatic, rather than explicitly violent. This detail is crucial because it illuminates the complex calculations that regulatory authorities make when evaluating content for public consumption. Unlike obvious cases involving explicit violence, sexual content, or political messaging, this scene occupied a gray area where normal activities intersect with potential harm in ways that challenge standard categorization systems. This type of regulatory challenge connects to broader patterns we see throughout history in how authorities have managed the boundary between acceptable and unacceptable cultural content. The great empires and their leaders typically established clear categories for what could and could not be expressed publicly, but these systems usually dealt with obviously political or religious content rather than the subtle psychological and social effects of everyday representations. The Roman Empire, for instance, had clear policies about political satire and religious expression, but spent little energy regulating how daily activities were depicted in entertainment. Medieval European authorities focused heavily on theological content and political loyalty, but rarely concerned themselves with the details of how craft activities or domestic life were portrayed. Even modern authoritarian systems typically concentrate their censorship efforts on obviously political content, rather than the minute details of character actions in entertainment contexts. The kitchen Casanova case represents something distinctively contemporary: regulatory concern about the potential imitative effects of seemingly minor character actions. The underlying logic appears to be that viewers, particularly younger ones, might copy dangerous behaviors they see depicted in entertainment, even when those behaviors are presented as accidental rather than intentional. This reflects a sophisticated understanding of media influence that goes beyond traditional concerns about explicit messaging to encompass subtle modeling effects. This approach to content regulation embodies a particular philosophy about human psychology and social responsibility that differs markedly from historical approaches. Traditional censorship typically assumed that audiences could distinguish between entertainment and reality, between fictional representation and behavioral instruction. The focus was on preventing the spread of dangerous ideas rather than dangerous actions, on controlling what people thought rather than what they might do. The concern about imitative behavior reflected in the kitchen Casanova ban suggests a more complex understanding of media influence that acknowledges the unconscious and behavioral dimensions of entertainment consumption. This perspective recognizes that audiences don't just absorb explicit messages from entertainment content, but also pick up subtle cues about normal behavior, acceptable risk-taking, and appropriate responses to various situations. This shift in regulatory philosophy connects to broader changes in how democratic societies understand the relationship between individual agency and social influence. The traditional liberal framework emphasized individual responsibility and assumed that rational adults could make appropriate distinctions between entertainment and reality, but contemporary understanding of psychology, particularly regarding children and adolescents, suggests that media influence operates through more subtle and unconscious mechanisms than this framework acknowledges. The specific focus on kitchen safety in the kitchen Casanova case also reveals important cultural anxieties about domestic space and everyday danger. Kitchens occupy a unique position in contemporary culture as spaces that are simultaneously domestic and dangerous, creative and potentially destructive. They contain tools and processes that can cause serious injury but are also associated with nurturing creativity and family life. This cultural tension around kitchen space reflects broader anxieties about risk management in contemporary society. Unlike historical periods when danger was primarily external, from warfare, disease, or natural disaster, modern safety concerns increasingly focus on managing risks within domestic and recreational contexts. Kitchen accidents, sports injuries, and recreational mishaps have become significant public health concerns in ways that require new approaches to prevention and education. The regulatory response to kitchen Casanova can be understood as part of this broader cultural project of managing domestic risk through information control. Rather than simply warning audiences about kitchen dangers or providing safety education, the approach involves controlling how kitchen activities are represented in entertainment to minimize the possibility of dangerous imitation. This strategy reflects a particular theory about how behavioral change occurs that emphasizes environmental modification rather than individual education. Instead of assuming that people will make good choices if given proper information, this approach assumes that people's choices are significantly influenced by the behavioral models they encounter in their cultural environment. This environmental approach to behavioral influence connects to patterns we see in how successful rulers and institutions have shaped social behavior throughout history. The most effective leaders typically understood that changing behavior required more than issuing commands or providing rational arguments. They needed to create cultural environments that made desired behavior seem normal, natural, and socially approved. Confucian approaches to governance, for instance, emphasized the importance of moral modeling by leaders and cultural elites. The assumption was that proper behavior would spread through society if people saw respected figures acting appropriately. This required careful attention to how authority figures presented themselves in public, and what kinds of behaviors were celebrated or criticized in cultural contexts. Similarly, successful religious movements have typically paid careful attention to controlling the cultural environment in which their adherents live. Rather than simply teaching correct doctrine, they create comprehensive cultural systems that reinforce desired behaviors through ritual, narrative, symbol, and social pressure. The kitchen Casanova ban reflects a secular version of this environmental approach to behavioral influence. By controlling how kitchen activities are depicted in entertainment, regulatory authorities attempt to create a cultural environment that discourages dangerous kitchen behaviors without requiring explicit safety education or individual decision-making. But this approach also raises important questions about the proper scope of regulatory authority in democratic societies. If entertainment content can be banned based on concerns about subtle behavioral influence, where are the boundaries of such regulation? Should authorities evaluate every depicted activity for its potential imitative effects? How do societies balance the goal of preventing harm with the values of creative freedom and individual agency? These questions become particularly complex when we consider the selective nature of content regulation. Many forms of entertainment routinely depict risky behaviors, from action movies that show dangerous driving, to cooking shows that demonstrate advanced knife techniques, without triggering regulatory intervention. The decision to ban Kitchen Casanova for its finger-cutting scene reflects judgments about audience vulnerability, content context, and risk assessment that are rarely made explicit or subjected to systematic analysis. This selective enforcement pattern reveals the inherently political nature of content regulation, even when the specific concerns appear to be purely about safety. The decisions about which risks to worry about, which audiences to protect, and which content creators to regulate reflect broader social priorities and power relationships that extend far beyond the immediate safety considerations. The case also illuminates the complex relationship between regulatory authority and industry self-regulation in contemporary media systems. Unlike direct government censorship, which operates through legal prohibition, the ban on Kitchen Casanova likely emerged through industry standards, advertiser pressure, or platform policies that create effective censorship without formal state intervention. This privatized censorship system has both advantages and disadvantages compared to traditional government regulation. On the positive side, it allows for more nuanced decision-making, faster response to emerging concerns, and flexibility in adapting to changing social standards. It also avoids the constitutional and political complications that accompany direct government censorship in democratic societies. On the negative side, privatized censorship lacks democratic accountability, operates through opaque decision-making processes, and can create inconsistent standards that vary across platforms and contexts. Content creators often have little insight into why their work was banned and limited recourse for challenging such decisions. This system of distributed censorship authority connects to broader patterns in how contemporary democratic societies manage social coordination without centralized control. Rather than relying on government agencies to establish and enforce uniform standards, these societies increasingly operate through networks of private actors who coordinate their behavior through market signals, professional norms, and informal pressure. This distributed approach to social control can be more flexible and responsive than centralized regulation, but it can also create accountability gaps and inconsistent outcomes that undermine both creative freedom and public safety. When responsibility for content decisions is spread across multiple private actors, it becomes difficult to evaluate whether those decisions serve appropriate public purposes or reflect appropriate democratic values. The specific concern about kitchen safety in the Kitchen Casanova case also reflects broader cultural tensions about expertise, authority, and behavioral guidance in contemporary society. Kitchens are spaces where many people feel confident about their own knowledge and abilities, but they are also spaces where professional expertise about safety, technique, and equipment can make significant differences in outcomes. This tension between personal confidence and expert knowledge creates complex challenges for content regulation. Should entertainment content be held to professional safety standards, or should it be allowed to reflect the more casual approaches that many people use in their own kitchens? Should regulatory decisions be made by safety experts, entertainment industry professionals, or representatives of general audiences? These questions don't have easy answers, but they reveal important assumptions about knowledge, authority, and responsibility that shape content regulation decisions. The ban on Kitchen Casanova suggests a preference for expert safety standards over authentic representation of common behaviors, but this preference is rarely acknowledged or defended explicitly. The case also raises questions about the relationship between entertainment content and educational responsibility.
Traditional approaches to media distinguished clearly between entertainment and education, assuming that audiences would apply different standards and expectations to each category. But contemporary understanding of media influence suggests that this distinction may be less meaningful than previously assumed. If entertainment content influences behavior through modeling and normalization rather than explicit instruction, then perhaps it should be held to educational standards regarding accuracy, safety, and social responsibility. But if entertainment content is evaluated primarily for its educational value, this might severely constrain creative freedom and artistic expression. The global dimensions of contemporary media distribution add another layer of complexity to content regulation decisions like the kitchen Casanova ban. Content created for one cultural context may be distributed to audiences with different safety standards, kitchen practices, and regulatory expectations. What seems like reasonable caution in one context may appear as excessive restriction in another. This global distribution challenge reflects broader questions about cultural sovereignty and regulatory authority in interconnected media systems. Should content be regulated according to the standards of its country of origin, its primary audience, or the most restrictive standards among its potential audiences? How do democratic societies balance respect for cultural differences with concerns about universal safety standards? The technological context of contemporary media consumption also affects how content regulation decisions like the kitchen Casanova ban actually function in practice. Unlike traditional broadcast media, where regulatory decisions could effectively prevent audience access to banned content, contemporary digital distribution systems make such control much more difficult to maintain. Content banned from mainstream platforms may still be available through alternative distribution channels, foreign platforms, or peer-to-peer sharing systems. This technological reality raises questions about the effectiveness of content bans and whether regulatory energy might be better directed toward education, labeling, or other approaches that acknowledge the practical limitations of content control. The kitchen Casanova case also illuminates important questions about cultural representation and diversity in entertainment content. If regulatory concerns about safety lead to the systematic removal of content depicting everyday activities like cooking, this might result in entertainment environments that are sanitized in ways that disconnect them from authentic human experience. This sanitization effect could be particularly problematic for audiences who rely on entertainment media for cultural information about activities, relationships, or experiences outside their direct personal knowledge. If entertainment content is required to meet safety standards that are higher than those that apply to real-world activities, this might create unrealistic expectations or fail to prepare audiences for the actual risks they will encounter. The case raises broader questions about the proper relationship between entertainment content and social reality. Should entertainment present idealized versions of human activity that model safe and responsible behavior? Should it present realistic depictions that acknowledge the risks and messiness of actual human experience? Or should it operate according to purely artistic criteria that prioritize dramatic or comedic effect over educational or safety considerations? These questions don't have universal answers, but the way particular societies answer them reveals important information about their values, priorities, and assumptions about human nature and social responsibility. The decision to ban Kitchen Casanova for its kitchen accident scene reflects particular answers to these questions that prioritize safety concerns over representational authenticity or creative freedom. The lasting significance of cases like Kitchen Casanova may lie less in their immediate regulatory effects than in what they reveal about evolving approaches to cultural control in democratic societies. As understanding of media influence becomes more sophisticated and concerns about behavioral modeling become more prominent, we may see increasing regulatory attention to content details that previous generations would have considered trivial. This trend toward more granular content regulation reflects both advancing knowledge about media effects and changing social expectations about institutional responsibility for preventing harm. But it also raises important questions about the proper scope of such regulation and how democratic societies should balance competing values of safety, freedom, and authenticity. The Kitchen Casanova ban represents a particular moment in the ongoing negotiation of these competing values. Its specific details may seem minor, but its broader implications for understanding content regulation, cultural control, and social responsibility in democratic societies remain significant. Through the analytical framework we use for understanding power and governance throughout history, the Kitchen Casanova case reveals how contemporary democratic societies have developed sophisticated mechanisms for cultural control that operate through distributed authority, private regulation, and concerns about subtle behavioral influence. Unlike the direct censorship systems used by historical empires and authoritarian regimes, these contemporary approaches work through complex networks of institutional actors who coordinate their behavior around shared concerns about social responsibility and public safety.
This evolution in censorship mechanisms reflects both the strengths and vulnerabilities of democratic approaches to social coordination. The system's flexibility and responsiveness allow it to address emerging concerns quickly and adapt to changing social standards, but its distributed nature and lack of clear accountability mechanisms can create arbitrary outcomes and limit democratic oversight of important cultural decisions. As societies continue to grapple with questions about media influence, social responsibility, and cultural boundaries, cases like Kitchen Casanova will likely become more rather than less common. Understanding how such decisions are made, what values they reflect, and what alternatives might be available becomes increasingly important for maintaining appropriate democratic control over the cultural environments that shape social behavior and individual development. The ban on Kitchen Casanova may have seemed like a minor regulatory decision focused on a specific safety concern, but its broader implications for understanding contemporary approaches to cultural control and social coordination make it a significant case study in how democratic societies navigate the complex relationships between entertainment, education, regulation, and freedom in an interconnected and rapidly changing world.
Postcards from Buster. Sugar Time. When government officials redefined family television. In 2005, a children's educational program about a cartoon rabbit visiting real families across America triggered one of the most significant government interventions in public television content in decades. Postcards from Buster. Sugar Time featured Buster visiting Vermont to learn about maple syrup production. But the episode's brief inclusion of a family with lesbian parents prompted then Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings to threaten federal funding cuts to PBS. This wasn't simply a case of cultural controversy or audience complaint. It was direct government pressure applied to suppress content that depicted social realities increasingly common in American society, revealing profound tensions about representation, authority, and the boundaries of acceptable discourse in democratic media systems. To understand why this episode matters beyond its immediate cultural impact, we must examine it through the lens of power dynamics, governmental authority over cultural institutions, and the evolving relationship between official ideology and social reality in democratic societies. Because the Sugar Time controversy reveals something crucial about how governments attempt to control cultural narratives even within democratic frameworks, how educational media becomes a battleground for competing visions of social order, and why the representation of family structures carries such intense political significance. The episode itself was seemingly innocuous, focusing primarily on the educational content about maple syrup production that formed the core of the Postcards from Buster series. Buster, the animated rabbit character from the popular children's show Arthur, visited a Vermont farm to learn how maple syrup is made, following the typical format of combining entertainment with educational content that characterized public television programming for children. The controversial element was incidental to this main narrative. The family Buster visited happened to include two mothers, depicted naturally and matter-of-factly as part of the family structure without explicit focus on their relationship or sexual orientation. This naturalistic representation strategy reflects a particular approach to social inclusion that had been developing in children's media throughout the early 2000s. Rather than creating special episodes specifically about different family structures or sexual orientations, producers were beginning to include diverse families as background elements of stories focused on other topics. This approach assumed that showing diverse families as normal parts of the social landscape would help children understand and accept such diversity without making it seem unusual or problematic. But this strategy also made the content more vulnerable to political challenge precisely because it normalized rather than explicitly addressed difference. When diverse families are presented as special topics requiring discussion and explanation, audiences understand that they are encountering intentional educational content about social issues. When such families appear incidentally as part of everyday reality, the representation carries different implications about what society considers normal and acceptable. The government response to Sugar Time reveals important insights about how democratic authorities attempt to control cultural content when direct censorship is constitutionally prohibited. Secretary Spellings couldn't simply ban the episode or order its removal, as might occur in authoritarian systems. Instead, she had to work through the indirect leverage provided by federal funding relationships, threatening to review PBS's government support if they proceeded with broadcasting content that contradicted official policy preferences. This approach to cultural control through funding pressure represents a distinctively democratic form of soft censorship that appears voluntary while functioning coercively. PBS technically remained free to broadcast the episode, but only by risking financial consequences that could undermine their broader mission. This creates the appearance of institutional choice while structuring incentives in ways that make certain choices practically impossible. The funding-based approach to content control connects to broader patterns we see throughout history in how authorities have managed cultural institutions without resort to direct prohibition. Successful rulers have typically understood that controlling resources can be more effective than controlling content directly, because it allows cultural producers to self-censor while maintaining the fiction of creative freedom. The patronage systems developed by Renaissance Italian city-states, for instance, gave political authorities significant influence over artistic content without requiring explicit censorship. Artists who wanted financial support learned to anticipate patron preferences and avoid topics or approaches that might jeopardize their funding.
This created cultural environments that appeared diverse and creative, while actually reflecting the political and social preferences of those who controlled resources. Similarly, the corporate sponsorship systems that developed in 20th century American media created indirect forms of content control that operated through advertiser preferences rather than government regulation. Television programs learned to avoid content that might alienate sponsors, creating self-censorship effects that were often more restrictive than formal government regulation would have been. The Sugar Time case demonstrates how these historical patterns of indirect cultural control continue to operate within contemporary democratic systems, adapted to the specific institutional arrangements of public broadcasting and federal education policy. The episode's suppression resulted not from legal prohibition but from the structural realities of how public television is funded and governed in the United States. The educational context of the controversy adds another layer of significance to the government intervention. Postcards from Buster was specifically designed as educational programming, funded through federal education initiatives, and intended to serve pedagogical as well as entertainment functions. This educational mandate gave government officials a stronger basis for asserting influence over content than they might have possessed with purely commercial entertainment programming. But the educational framework also revealed important tensions about the proper scope of public education and government authority over children's cultural environment. The series was designed to teach children about diverse American communities and family structures, but the government intervention suggested that some forms of diversity were educationally inappropriate despite their increasing prevalence in actual American society. This tension between educational representation and social reality connects to broader patterns we see throughout history and how governments have managed the relationship between official ideology and lived experience. Successful states typically require some alignment between what they teach children and what children observe in their daily lives, but they also use educational systems to promote idealized versions of social reality that may not reflect actual social conditions. The Confucian educational systems developed in Imperial China, for instance, taught idealized models of family structure, social hierarchy, and political authority that provided frameworks for understanding social reality without necessarily describing it accurately. Students learned how families, communities, and governments were supposed to function, which gave them tools for navigating actual social relationships while also reinforcing official preferences about social organization. The Sugar Time controversy reveals similar tensions in contemporary American educational media. The series was designed to show children real American families and communities, but government intervention suggested that some real families were considered educationally inappropriate despite their legal status and social acceptance in many communities. The specific focus on family structure in the controversy also illuminates broader political struggles about social authority and cultural change in contemporary democratic societies. Family arrangements have always been central to political authority because they shape how children learn about social relationships, authority structures, and cultural values. Governments that want to influence social development typically pay careful attention to how families are represented in educational and cultural content. The opposition to depicting lesbian parents in Sugar Time reflected broader political efforts to maintain traditional family structures as normative models despite increasing legal and social acceptance of diverse family arrangements. This position assumed that government-funded educational content should reinforce preferred social models rather than simply reflecting social reality, but this approach also created practical problems because it required public television to present a version of American society that diverged increasingly from the actual experiences of many children and families. As legal recognition of same-sex relationships expanded throughout the early 2000s, educational content that excluded such families became less representative of actual American social conditions. The controversy's timing in 2005 was significant because it occurred during a period of rapid legal and social change regarding same-sex relationships. Massachusetts had legalized same-sex marriage in 2003, other states were considering similar legislation, and public opinion was shifting in ways that suggested broader legal changes were likely. The government intervention in Sugar Time can be understood as an attempt to slow or limit these changes by controlling how they were represented in children's media. This use of cultural control to resist social change connects to broader patterns we see throughout history in how governments attempt to manage transitions between different social arrangements. The most effective resistance to social change often operates through cultural rather than legal mechanisms, because controlling representations can influence how people understand and respond to changing social conditions. The British government's response to the decline of empire in the mid-20th century, for instance, included careful management of how imperial history was taught in schools and represented in popular media. Rather than directly prohibiting discussion of decolonization, authorities emphasized particular interpretations of imperial history that presented British rule as beneficial and its ending as unfortunate but necessary. Similarly, the Soviet Union's management of social change during the Glasnost period involved complex negotiations about which aspects of Soviet history could be discussed openly and which needed to remain officially suppressed. Cultural representation became a key battleground for competing visions of Soviet society and its future development.
The Sugar Time controversy demonstrates how similar dynamics operate within democratic systems, where governments cannot directly control cultural content, but can use funding relationships and institutional pressure to influence how social changes are represented in educational and public media. The response from PBS and the broader public television community to the government pressure reveals important insights about institutional resilience and resistance within democratic media systems. Some PBS stations chose to air the episode despite federal pressure, while others declined to broadcast it. This fragmented response reflected the decentralized structure of public television in the United States, where individual stations maintain some autonomy over programming decisions. This institutional structure created a form of federalism in cultural policy that allowed different communities to make different choices about the episode, while limiting the federal government's ability to enforce uniform standards. Some communities saw the episode while others did not, reflecting local preferences and institutional arrangements, rather than unified national policy. The decentralized response pattern connects to broader questions about cultural federalism and local control in democratic societies. The American system of local control over education and media has historically allowed communities to adapt national policies to local preferences and values, but it has also created inconsistencies in cultural and educational content that can be problematic for national cohesion and individual rights. The Sugar Time case demonstrates both the advantages and disadvantages of this decentralized approach. The system allowed communities that supported inclusive representation to maintain access to the episode, while protecting communities that opposed such content from being forced to broadcast it. But it also created a patchwork of access that meant children's educational opportunities varied significantly based on local political preferences. The long-term impact of the controversy on public television programming reveals important lessons about how government pressure affects cultural content in democratic systems. Following the Sugar Time incident, PBS appears to have become more cautious about including content that might trigger similar government intervention, suggesting that the soft censorship achieved its intended chilling effect on future programming decisions.
This chilling effect demonstrates how indirect government pressure can be more effective than direct censorship in shaping cultural content over time. Rather than simply suppressing specific episodes or programs, funding-based pressure creates incentives for content producers to self-censor in ways that avoid future conflicts with government officials. The pattern connects to broader concerns about how government funding relationships affect cultural and educational independence in democratic societies. When public institutions depend on government support, they become vulnerable to political pressure that can compromise their ability to serve public rather than partisan interests. The international context of the controversy also reveals important insights about American cultural policy and its global implications. The United States has historically promoted democratic values and cultural freedom internationally, while sometimes restricting such freedom domestically when it conflicts with particular political preferences. The Sugar Time case created a contradiction between American international advocacy for media freedom and domestic pressure on public broadcasting. This contradiction reflects broader tensions in how democratic societies balance competing values of freedom, tradition, and social order. The principles that justify democratic criticism of authoritarian censorship can also support arguments for inclusive representation in domestic media, but political authorities may resist applying such principles consistently when they conflict with preferred social arrangements. The controversy's resolution through institutional pressure rather than legal prohibition also demonstrates how democratic censorship operates differently from authoritarian suppression, while potentially achieving similar outcomes. The episode was effectively banned from significant portions of American public television without any formal legal action, showing how soft power mechanisms can function as alternatives to direct censorship. This soft censorship approach has both advantages and disadvantages compared to direct government control. It maintains the appearance of institutional freedom while achieving desired content outcomes, but it also creates accountability problems because the censorship occurs through informal pressure rather than transparent legal processes. The educational implications of the controversy extend beyond the immediate question of family representation to broader issues about how democratic societies prepare children for life in diverse social environments. As legal and social acceptance of diverse family structures continues to expand, educational content that excludes such families may leave children unprepared for social realities they will encounter as adults. This preparation function of education creates tensions between representing ideal social arrangements and preparing students for actual social conditions. The Sugar Time controversy revealed fundamental disagreements about whether educational content should promote particular family models or simply acknowledge diverse family realities without preference. The case also illuminates important questions about the relationship between federal authority and local control in educational and cultural content. The intervention by federal education officials in a local programming decision raised constitutional questions about government authority over cultural content and the proper scope of federal influence over educational materials. These federalism questions connect to broader debates about the appropriate balance between national standards and local control in education and cultural policy. The Sugar Time case suggested that federal officials believed they had authority to influence educational content funded through federal programs, but this authority was contested by local broadcasters and community groups who emphasized local control over cultural decisions. The controversy's lasting significance may lie less in its immediate outcomes than in what it revealed about the mechanisms through which government pressure operates on cultural institutions in democratic societies. The case demonstrated how funding relationships create leverage for government officials even when direct censorship is constitutionally prohibited, and how such leverage can be used to shape cultural content in ways that reflect political rather than educational priorities. Through the analytical framework we use for understanding power and cultural control throughout history, the Sugar Time controversy reveals how contemporary democratic governments have developed sophisticated mechanisms for influencing cultural content without resort to direct censorship. Like successful rulers throughout history, modern democratic authorities understand that controlling cultural representation can be more effective than controlling political expression and shaping social attitudes and behaviors. But the case also demonstrates the limitations and contradictions of such influence in democratic systems. The decentralized structure of American media and education created opportunities for resistance and alternative choices that would not exist in more centralized systems. The controversy sparked broader public discussions about representation, government authority, and cultural diversity that may have ultimately advanced the very social acceptance that the government intervention sought to limit. The Sugar Time episode remains a significant case study in how democratic societies navigate tensions between government authority and cultural freedom, between traditional values and social change, and between national policy and local control. Its impact on public television programming continues to influence how educational media approaches sensitive social topics, demonstrating the lasting effects of government pressure on cultural institutions. As democratic societies continue to grapple with questions about representation, authority, and social change, the lessons from Sugar Time remain relevant for understanding how government influence operates in cultural spheres, and how institutions and communities can respond to such pressure while maintaining their educational and democratic missions. The case reminds us that censorship in democratic societies often operates through subtle mechanisms that can be more effective than direct prohibition in shaping cultural content and public discourse. Looney Tunes, Good Noose, when classic animation crossed the line of childhood trauma. In the landscape of animated entertainment, few controversies reveal as much about evolving cultural boundaries and psychological understanding as the case of Good Noose, a Looney Tunes short featuring Daffy Duck in a hanging scenario that was ultimately deemed too traumatic for audiences. This wasn't simply a matter of outdated humor or changing social sensitivities. It represented a fundamental shift in how democratic societies understand childhood psychology, media influence, and the responsibility of entertainment institutions to protect vulnerable audiences from potentially harmful content. To understand why this particular animated sequence matters beyond its immediate controversy, we must examine it through the lens of power dynamics in cultural production, the evolution of psychological understanding about trauma and media consumption, and the complex mechanisms through which democratic societies establish and enforce boundaries around acceptable entertainment content. Because the Good Noose case reveals crucial insights about how cultural authorities navigate the tension between creative expression and psychological protection, how understanding of trauma has reshaped entertainment standards, and why certain forms of violence become unacceptable even within traditionally permissive comedic contexts. The Looney Tunes franchise had built its reputation on a particular form of anarchic comedy that featured characters surviving extreme violence through cartoon physics and comedic timing. From Wile E. Coyote's endless falls and explosions to the various mishaps that befell characters like Porky Pig and Bugs Bunny, the series had established conventions that allowed audiences to process violent imagery as harmless entertainment rather than realistic threat. This comedic framework depended on clear signals that the violence was fantastical, temporary, and ultimately inconsequential within the cartoon universe. But hanging, even in animated form, carries cultural and psychological associations that resist easy comedic treatment. Unlike the cartoonish explosions or falls that characterize typical Looney Tunes violence, hanging references specific historical realities of execution, suicide, and death that connect to trauma experiences many audience members might have encountered directly or indirectly. This connection between animated content and serious real-world experiences created psychological associations that the traditional cartoon comedy framework couldn't effectively contain or neutralize. This challenge connects to broader patterns we see throughout history and how entertainment forms have had to navigate the boundary between acceptable and unacceptable representations of violence and death. The gladiatorial games of ancient Rome, for instance, provided socially sanctioned outlets for violent entertainment, but even they operated within cultural frameworks that distinguished between acceptable and unacceptable forms of violence based on social status, religious significance, and political context. Medieval European entertainment forms like mystery plays and folk festivals often included depictions of death and violence, but these were typically embedded within religious or moral frameworks that provided meaning and resolution to the disturbing content. The violence served pedagogical or spiritual purposes that helped audiences process and understand its significance, rather than simply consuming it as entertainment. The development of modern entertainment industries has complicated these traditional frameworks by creating content that reaches diverse audiences with different cultural backgrounds, psychological vulnerabilities, and interpretive frameworks. What might be acceptable within one cultural context may be traumatic within another, and content creators often lack the intimate knowledge of their audiences that would allow them to calibrate their material appropriately. The Good News case demonstrates how these complications play out in contemporary media production. The creators likely approached the hanging scenario within the established Looney Tunes framework of cartoonish violence, assuming that audiences would process it as harmless slapstick comedy. But the specific nature of hanging as a form of violence triggered psychological responses that the traditional cartoon framework couldn't adequately manage. This disconnect between creative intent and audience reception reveals important insights about how cultural content operates in democratic societies where diverse audiences consume material through different interpretive frameworks. Unlike historical entertainment forms that typically served relatively homogeneous communities with shared cultural references and psychological preparation, modern mass media must somehow address audience diversity while maintaining artistic coherence. The recognition that the hanging scenario was too traumatic reflects evolving understanding of how media consumption affects psychological development, particularly in children. Traditional approaches to children's entertainment assumed that animated content was inherently safe because its unrealistic presentation would prevent children from taking it seriously or applying it to real-world situations. But contemporary psychological research suggests that children's processing of media content is more complex and vulnerable than this traditional framework acknowledged. Children may absorb emotional and psychological content from entertainment media even when they intellectually understand that the content is fictional. Images and scenarios that trigger fear, anxiety, or trauma responses can have lasting psychological effects regardless of their fictional context. This understanding has led to more sophisticated approaches to content evaluation that consider not just explicit messaging or realistic depiction, but also the psychological and emotional impact of specific images, scenarios, and narrative elements. The hanging scenario in Good News was problematic not because it was realistic or because it promoted dangerous behavior, but because it triggered psychological responses associated with death anxiety and trauma that could be harmful to vulnerable viewers. This psychological approach to content evaluation connects to broader shifts we see throughout history in how societies understand and respond to human vulnerability. The most successful civilizations have typically developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of human psychology and have adapted their institutions and practices to protect vulnerable populations from harm. The development of legal protections for children, for instance, reflects growing recognition that children's psychological and physical vulnerability requires special consideration in how societies organize their institutions and practices. Similarly, the evolution of medical understanding has led to more nuanced approaches to treating psychological as well as physical illness. The Good News case represents part of this broader historical evolution toward more psychologically informed approaches to social organization. Rather than simply assuming that fictional content is harmless, contemporary societies are developing more sophisticated understanding of how different types of content affect different types of audiences under different circumstances. But this evolution also creates new challenges for creative expression and cultural production. As understanding of media effects becomes more sophisticated, content creators face increasingly complex requirements to consider not just artistic merit or entertainment value, but also potential psychological impact on diverse and potentially vulnerable audiences. This expansion of creative responsibility connects to broader questions about the proper balance between artistic freedom and social responsibility in democratic societies. Traditional liberal frameworks emphasized individual choice and assumed that audiences could make appropriate decisions about their own media consumption. But contemporary understanding of media effects suggests that such individual choice may be less meaningful than previously assumed, particularly for vulnerable populations like children. The institutional response to Good News also reveals important insights about how democratic societies manage cultural content without resort to direct government censorship. Rather than being banned by legal authority, the cartoon was withdrawn by media companies and broadcasting institutions that recognized its potential for causing harm and chose to remove it from circulation. This self-regulatory approach represents a distinctively democratic mechanism for managing cultural content that operates through institutional judgment rather than legal prohibition. Content creators and distributors make decisions about appropriate material based on their understanding of audience needs, social responsibilities, and potential legal or reputational consequences of distributing harmful content. But this self-regulatory system also creates accountability challenges because the decision-making processes are often opaque, and the criteria for content evaluation may vary significantly across different institutions and contexts.
Unlike legal prohibition, which operates through transparent processes with clear standards and appeal mechanisms, institutional self-regulation can result in arbitrary or inconsistent outcomes. The Good Noose case demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of this self-regulatory approach. The system allowed for quick response to emerging concerns about content appropriateness without requiring lengthy legal processes or government intervention. But it also meant that decisions about content were made by business executives and institutional managers, rather than through democratic processes or expert evaluation of psychological research. The specific concern about trauma in the Good Noose case also reflects broader cultural shifts in how democratic societies understand and respond to psychological injury. Traditional approaches to social organization focused primarily on preventing physical harm and assumed that psychological resilience was primarily an individual responsibility. But contemporary understanding of trauma suggests that psychological injury can be as significant and lasting as physical injury, and that societies have responsibilities to protect individuals from psychological as well as physical harm. This expanded understanding of injury has led to new approaches to content evaluation that consider psychological impact alongside traditional concerns about physical safety and moral instruction. This shift towards psychological protection connects to broader patterns we see throughout history in how successful societies have expanded their understanding of human needs and vulnerabilities. The development of public health systems, for instance, reflected growing recognition that individual health depends on social conditions and that communities have responsibilities to create environments that support rather than undermine individual well-being. Similarly, the evolution of educational systems has reflected increasing understanding of how environmental factors affect learning and development, leading to more sophisticated approaches to creating educational environments that support rather than hinder student growth. The Good Noose case represents part of this broader evolution toward more psychologically informed approaches to social organization. Rather than simply assuming that individuals can handle whatever content they encounter, contemporary societies are developing more nuanced understanding of how different types of content affect different types of people under different circumstances. The international dimensions of the controversy also reveal important insights about how cultural standards vary across different democratic societies, and how global media distribution creates challenges for content regulation. Animated content created for one cultural context may be distributed to audiences with different psychological frameworks, cultural references, and regulatory standards. This global distribution challenge reflects broader questions about cultural sovereignty and regulatory authority in interconnected media systems. Should content be evaluated according to the standards of its country of origin, its primary audience, or the most restrictive standards among its potential global audiences? The Good Noose case suggests that psychological concerns about trauma may transcend cultural boundaries in ways that make universal content standards more feasible than standards based on cultural or moral preferences. While different societies may have different views about appropriate moral content or cultural representation, the basic psychological mechanisms that create trauma responses may be similar enough across different populations to support more universal approaches to content evaluation. The technological context of contemporary media consumption also affects how content decisions like the Good Noose withdrawal actually function in practice. Unlike traditional broadcast media where institutional decisions could effectively control audience access to content, contemporary digital distribution systems make such control much more difficult to maintain. Content withdrawn from official distribution may still be available through alternative platforms, file-sharing systems, or international sources. This technological reality raises questions about the effectiveness of content withdrawal and whether protective efforts might be better directed toward education, labeling, or other approaches that acknowledge the practical limitations of content control. The educational implications of the Good Noose controversy extend beyond immediate concerns about childhood trauma to broader questions about how democratic societies prepare young people to engage with challenging or disturbing content. Rather than simply protecting children from all potentially harmful material, educational approaches might focus on developing psychological resilience and critical thinking skills that allow individuals to process difficult content more effectively. This educational alternative reflects broader debates about protective versus preparatory approaches to child development. Protective approaches emphasize shielding children from harmful experiences until they develop adequate coping mechanisms. Preparatory approaches emphasize developing coping mechanisms through carefully managed exposure to challenging material. The Good Noose case doesn't resolve these debates, but it illustrates how they play out in contemporary media contexts where children may encounter disturbing content regardless of official protective efforts. The most effective approaches may combine protective measures for the most vulnerable populations with educational efforts to help children develop resilience and critical thinking skills. The long-term impact of the Good Noose controversy on animation and children's entertainment reveals important lessons about how concerns about psychological trauma affect creative expression in democratic societies. Following incidents like this, content creators and distributors appear to have become more cautious about including material that might trigger trauma responses, even within traditionally permissive comedic contexts. This increased caution demonstrates how concerns about psychological harm can create chilling effects on creative expression that extend beyond specific problematic content to broader categories of potentially challenging material. Content creators may self-censor not just obviously problematic material but also borderline content that might trigger similar concerns. The pattern connects to broader questions about how protective approaches to media regulation affect cultural development and artistic expression. While protecting vulnerable audiences from harmful content serves important social purposes, excessive caution may also limit the ability of entertainment media to address challenging topics or explore complex emotional territory. The Good News case also illuminates important questions about the relationship between historical entertainment traditions and contemporary psychological understanding. The Looney Tunes franchise emerged from entertainment traditions that assumed audiences could distinguish between fictional violence and real violence, and that comedic presentation could neutralize potentially disturbing content. But contemporary understanding of trauma suggests that these traditional assumptions may not hold for all audiences under all circumstances. Some individuals, particularly those with relevant trauma histories or psychological vulnerabilities, may experience distressing responses to fictional content regardless of its comedic presentation or obviously unrealistic nature. This creates challenges for entertainment forms that depend on traditional frameworks for processing potentially disturbing content. Creators must somehow balance respect for historical entertainment traditions with contemporary understanding of psychological vulnerability and trauma response. The case ultimately demonstrates the ongoing evolution of cultural standards and psychological understanding in democratic societies. As knowledge about media effects and trauma response continues to develop, entertainment institutions must adapt their practices to incorporate new understanding while maintaining their cultural and artistic functions. Through the analytical framework we use for understanding power and cultural control throughout history, the Good News controversy reveals how contemporary democratic societies have developed sophisticated mechanisms for protecting vulnerable populations from potentially harmful cultural content. Unlike historical approaches that relied primarily on moral or religious frameworks for content evaluation, contemporary approaches increasingly incorporate psychological and scientific understanding of how media content affects human development and well-being. But the case also demonstrates the ongoing challenges of balancing protective concerns with values of creative expression and cultural tradition in democratic societies. The withdrawal of Good News served important protective functions, but it also represented a loss of historical entertainment content and raised questions about how far protective concerns should extend in limiting creative expression. As democratic societies continue to develop more sophisticated understanding of media effects and psychological vulnerability, cases like Good News will likely become more common. Understanding how such decisions are made, what values they reflect, and what alternatives might be available becomes increasingly important for maintaining appropriate balance between protection and expression in democratic cultural systems. The Good News controversy reminds us that even seemingly simple decisions about entertainment content reflect complex negotiations between competing values and evolving understanding of human psychology and social responsibility. As our knowledge of trauma and media effects continues to develop, these negotiations will likely become more rather than less complex, requiring ongoing attention to how democratic societies can protect vulnerable populations while maintaining vibrant and diverse cultural expression.
Ren and Stimpy, It's a Dog's Life, when children's animation confronted mortality's ultimate reality. In the landscape of children's television, few episodes have pushed the boundaries of acceptable content as far as It's a Dog's Life from the Ren and Stimpy show, which concluded with the main characters becoming taxidermied specimens after death. This wasn't merely controversial content or boundary-pushing humor, it was a direct confrontation with mortality, bodily integrity, and the ultimate fate of consciousness that challenged every assumption about what children's entertainment should address. The episode forced young audiences to confront philosophical questions about death, preservation, and posthumous existence that most adult entertainment carefully avoids. To understand why this episode matters beyond its immediate shock value, we must examine it through the lens of cultural taboos, philosophical frameworks for understanding mortality, and the complex relationship between entertainment and existential education in democratic societies. Because It's a Dog's Life reveals crucial insights about how different cultures approach death education, why certain representations of mortality become culturally unacceptable, and how the sanitization of death in modern society creates psychological vulnerabilities that entertainment media must navigate. The Ren and Stimpy show had established itself as a deliberately transgressive program that violated traditional boundaries of children's entertainment through gross-out humor, psychological intensity, and adult themes presented in cartoon form. But the taxidermy conclusion of It's a Dog's Life represented a qualitatively different challenge to audience expectations because it directly addressed the finality and physical reality of death in ways that resisted comedic resolution or psychological comfort. Unlike typical cartoon violence that implies temporary harm followed by magical recovery, taxidermy represents permanent transformation of living beings into preserved objects. The characters don't bounce back from this conclusion, don't wake up from a dream, don't reveal it as a misunderstanding. They simply transition from living subjects to preserved specimens, forcing audiences to confront the reality that consciousness ends while physical form persists in altered state. This confrontation with mortality's finality connects to broader patterns we see throughout history in how different civilizations have approached death education and the cultural transmission of mortality awareness. The most successful societies have typically developed sophisticated frameworks for helping individuals understand and cope with death, but these frameworks have varied dramatically in their specific approaches and underlying philosophies. Ancient Egyptian civilization, for instance, built its entire cultural framework around elaborate preparations for death and posthumous existence. Children grew up surrounded by representations of death, preservation, and afterlife that made mortality a central organizing principle of daily life. The process of mummification, similar to taxidermy in its preservation of physical form, was embedded within religious and philosophical frameworks that provided meaning and comfort regarding posthumous existence. Medieval European societies used religious frameworks to help individuals understand death as transition rather than ending, but they also exposed children to mortality through public executions, religious art depicting martyrdom, and cultural practices that made death visible and meaningful within community life. Death was not hidden from children but integrated into educational and spiritual development. Modern Western societies, by contrast, have largely sanitized death and removed it from everyday experience, particularly for children. Most children in contemporary democratic societies have little direct exposure to death, dying, or the physical realities of mortality until they encounter it through media or personal loss. This sanitization may protect children from trauma, but it may also leave them psychologically unprepared for mortality's inevitability. The It's a Dog's Life episode can be understood as accidentally exposing this cultural gap between mortality's reality and children's preparation for understanding it. By presenting death and preservation without the protective frameworks that historically help children process such content, the episode created a form of existential shock that contemporary audiences were unprepared to handle. This cultural unpreparedness reflects broader challenges we see in how democratic societies manage the tension between protecting children from disturbing realities and preparing them for life in a world where such realities are inevitable. The traditional approach of gradual exposure through age-appropriate content assumes that children will develop psychological resilience over time, but it may also create vulnerabilities when they encounter unfiltered content that violates these protective boundaries. The specific choice of taxidermy as the episode's conclusion adds layers of cultural significance that compound its psychological impact. Taxidermy occupies a unique position in contemporary culture as a practice that preserves animal life forms for human purposes, creating uncanny representations that blur the boundary between life and death, natural and artificial, subject and object. This boundary-blurring quality makes taxidermy particularly disturbing because it challenges fundamental categories that humans use to organize their understanding of reality. Living beings are supposed to move, respond, and change. Dead beings are supposed to decay, disappear, and return to natural cycles. Taxidermy violates both expectations by creating forms that appear alive but lack consciousness, that resist decay but cannot respond. When applied to cartoon characters with whom children have formed emotional relationships, taxidermy becomes even more psychologically challenging because it transforms beloved figures into objects while maintaining their recognizable appearance. Children watching the episode must process the cognitive dissonance between characters they care about and their transformation into preserved specimens. This psychological challenge connects to broader questions about how entertainment media should handle the emotional relationships that audiences, particularly children, develop with fictional characters. Traditional children's entertainment typically protects these relationships by ensuring that beloved characters either survive their adventures or die in ways that provide meaningful closure and emotional resolution. The taxidermy conclusion violates these protective conventions by presenting character death without meaning, resolution, or emotional comfort. The characters don't die heroically or peacefully or for important reasons. They simply die and become objects, forcing audiences to confront the possibility that death might be meaningless transformation rather than meaningful transition. This confrontation with meaningless death reflects philosophical positions that most children's entertainment carefully avoids. Traditional approaches to mortality in children's media typically embed death within frameworks that provide meaning, purpose, or continuation. Characters who die often sacrifice themselves for others, join spiritual realms, or live on through memory and influence. But the taxidermy conclusion suggests a more nihilistic vision, where death is simply termination of consciousness and transformation of body into object. This philosophical position, while arguably more realistic than comforting alternatives, poses significant challenges for young audiences who lack the intellectual and emotional frameworks necessary to process such radical meaninglessness. The episode's approach to mortality also reveals important cultural assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and physical form that may be particularly disturbing for children who are still developing their understanding of personal identity and bodily integrity. The transformation from living character to preserved specimen suggests that identity is purely physical, that consciousness is ephemeral, and that the essential self can be reduced to external appearance. These implications challenge fundamental assumptions about personal continuity and identity that are crucial for psychological development. Children need to believe that their essential selves persist through time and change, that their consciousness is meaningful and enduring, and that their physical form represents rather than constitutes their identity. The taxidermy conclusion undermines these developmental needs by suggesting that identity is purely external, and that consciousness is entirely dependent on physical form. When physical form is preserved but consciousness is eliminated, the result challenges basic assumptions about what makes individuals who they are and what happens to identity when life ends. The cultural response to the episode, including its removal from regular broadcast rotation, demonstrates how democratic societies manage content that violates fundamental psychological and cultural boundaries. Unlike direct government censorship, the suppression of It's a Dog's Life occurred through network decisions and industry self-regulation that recognized the content's potential for causing psychological harm. This self-regulatory response reflects sophisticated understanding of how media content affects audience psychology, particularly for vulnerable populations like children. Rather than waiting for government intervention or audience complaints, media institutions proactively removed content that violated their understanding of appropriate boundaries for children's entertainment. But this institutional response also raises important questions about who has authority to make such decisions and what criteria should guide content evaluation. The episode was removed not because it violated legal standards or explicit network policies, but because it triggered institutional judgment that it was inappropriate for its intended audience. This judgment-based approach to content regulation demonstrates both the flexibility and the potential arbitrariness of democratic approaches to cultural control. The system allows for quick response to emerging concerns without requiring lengthy legal processes, but it also means that important decisions about cultural content are made by business executives rather than through democratic processes or expert evaluation. The educational implications of the controversy extend beyond immediate concerns about childhood trauma to broader questions about how democratic societies should prepare young people to understand and cope with mortality. The episode's suppression may have protected children from immediate psychological distress, but it also eliminated an opportunity for discussing death and mortality in ways that might have been ultimately beneficial. This protective versus educational tension reflects broader debates about how societies should approach difficult topics in children's media and education. Protective approaches emphasize shielding children from disturbing content until they develop adequate coping mechanisms. Educational approaches emphasize providing children with frameworks for understanding difficult realities even when such understanding may be initially distressing. The It's a Dog's Life case suggests that contemporary democratic societies have generally chosen protective over educational approaches to mortality in children's media, but this choice may leave children unprepared for death when they encounter it in their personal lives. The sanitization of death in entertainment may contribute to the broader cultural denial of mortality that characterizes modern Western societies. The international dimensions of the controversy also reveal important insights about how different cultures approach death education and mortality representation. While the episode was considered inappropriate for American audiences, other cultures with different traditions of death education and child rearing might have responded differently to its content. This cultural variation in mortality representation reflects deeper philosophical differences about the proper relationship between children and awareness of death. Some cultures integrate death awareness into childhood development through religious education, cultural practices, and family traditions. Others emphasize protecting children from mortality awareness until they reach developmental stages considered appropriate for such understanding. The global distribution of contemporary media creates challenges for content creators who must somehow address these cultural differences while maintaining coherent artistic vision. Content created for one cultural context may be distributed to audiences with different psychological frameworks and cultural expectations about mortality representation. The technological context of contemporary media consumption also affects how content decisions like the suppression of It's a Dog's Life actually function in practice. While the episode was removed from official broadcast rotation, it remains available through alternative distribution channels, video sharing platforms,
and collector communities that preserve controversial or banned content. This technological reality demonstrates the practical limitations of content suppression in democratic societies. Unlike authoritarian systems that can more effectively control information distribution, democratic societies must rely on voluntary compliance and social pressure to manage cultural content. When institutions choose to suppress material, it often remains accessible through alternative channels. The artistic significance of the episode also raises important questions about the relationship between creative expression and social responsibility in children's entertainment. The taxidermy conclusion represented a bold artistic choice that challenged conventional boundaries and explored philosophical territory rarely addressed in children's media. From an artistic perspective, the episode demonstrated animation's capacity to address serious philosophical questions and provoke meaningful reflection about fundamental human experiences. The controversy itself suggests that the content was artistically effective in conveying its intended impact and generating audience response. But the social response also suggests that artistic merit alone may not justify content that violates psychological and cultural boundaries, particularly for vulnerable audiences. Democratic societies must somehow balance respect for creative expression with concern for potential harm to audiences who may not have chosen to encounter challenging content. The long-term impact of the episode on children's entertainment reveals important lessons about how concerns about mortality representation affect creative expression in democratic societies. Following controversies like It's a Dog's Life, content creators appear to have become more cautious about including material that directly addresses death and mortality, even within obviously fictional contexts. This increased caution demonstrates how protective concerns can create chilling effects on creative expression that extend beyond specific problematic content to broader categories of potentially challenging material. Content creators may self-censor not just obviously inappropriate material but also borderline content that might trigger similar concerns about psychological impact. The pattern connects to broader questions about how protective approaches to media regulation affect cultural development and philosophical education. While protecting children from traumatic content serves important purposes, excessive caution may also limit entertainment media's capacity to help audiences develop frameworks for understanding difficult realities. The episode's lasting cultural impact also demonstrates how controversial content can continue to influence cultural conversations long after its original broadcast. It's a Dog's Life has become a reference point for discussions about appropriate boundaries in children's entertainment, the relationship between animation and philosophical content, and the proper balance between creative expression and audience protection. This cultural legacy suggests that controversial content often serves important functions in cultural development even when it is suppressed or criticized. By pushing boundaries and generating discussion, such content helps societies clarify their values and establish cultural boundaries that reflect contemporary understanding of psychology, development, and social responsibility. Through the analytical framework we use for understanding power and cultural control throughout history, the It's a Dog's Life controversy reveals how contemporary democratic societies have developed sophisticated mechanisms for protecting vulnerable populations from potentially harmful cultural content while maintaining respect for creative expression and artistic freedom. Unlike historical approaches that relied primarily on religious or moral frameworks for content evaluation, contemporary approaches increasingly incorporate psychological and developmental understanding of how different types of content affect different types of audiences under different circumstances. But the case also demonstrates the ongoing challenges of balancing protective concerns with values of creative expression and philosophical education in democratic societies. The suppression of It's a Dog's Life served important protective functions, but it also eliminated opportunities for meaningful discussion about mortality, identity, and consciousness that might have been ultimately beneficial for audience development. As democratic societies continue to develop more sophisticated understanding of media effects and psychological development, cases like It's a Dog's Life will likely inform ongoing negotiations about appropriate boundaries for children's entertainment. Understanding how such decisions are made, what values they reflect, and what alternatives might be available becomes increasingly important for maintaining appropriate balance between protection and education in democratic cultural systems. The It's a Dog's Life controversy ultimately reminds us that even seemingly simple decisions about entertainment content reflect complex negotiations between competing values and evolving understanding of human psychology, cultural development, and social responsibility. As our knowledge of media effects and child development continues to evolve, these negotiations will likely become more rather than less complex, requiring ongoing attention to how democratic societies can protect vulnerable populations while maintaining vibrant and meaningful cultural expression that addresses fundamental human experiences and concerns.
The Mask, Flight as a Feather. When family entertainment crossed the line of gender violence, In the landscape of family entertainment, few controversies reveal as much about evolving cultural boundaries and gender representation as Flight as a Feather from the Mask animated series, which featured a scene involving a woman and dynamite that was ultimately deemed unacceptable for family channels. This wasn't simply a matter of excessive violence or inappropriate content, it represented a fundamental shift in how democratic societies understand gender-based violence, the responsibility of entertainment institutions to model appropriate behavior, and the complex relationship between comedic context and harmful representation. To understand why this particular animated sequence matters beyond its immediate controversy, we must examine it through the lens of power dynamics and gender representation, the evolution of cultural understanding about violence against women, and the mechanisms through which democratic societies establish and enforce boundaries around acceptable entertainment content. Because Flight as a Feather reveals crucial insights about how entertainment media both reflects and shapes social attitudes toward gender, how comedic context can normalize harmful behaviors, and why certain forms of representation become culturally unacceptable even within traditionally permissive comedic frameworks. The Mask franchise had built its identity around supernatural transformation that allowed ordinary characters to transcend normal limitations and engage in fantastical adventures with minimal real-world consequences. The magical mask granted its wearer incredible powers while also removing typical moral and social constraints, creating a framework where characters could engage in extreme behaviors while maintaining audience sympathy through the understanding that they were transformed beyond their normal personalities. But this transformation framework, while effective for general anarchic comedy, created particular problems when applied to gender-based scenarios involving violence or harm. The magical context that excused other forms of extreme behavior couldn't adequately address the real-world implications of depicting violence against women, even in obviously fictional and supernatural circumstances. This challenge connects to broader patterns we see throughout history in how entertainment forms have struggled to navigate the boundary between acceptable and unacceptable representations of gender relations and power dynamics. Unlike other forms of violence that can be more easily abstracted from real-world implications, gender-based violence carries cultural and psychological associations that resist comedic neutralization. The Roman theatrical traditions, for instance, included various forms of physical comedy and violent scenarios, but these were typically structured around class distinctions and social hierarchies rather than gender dynamics. When gender relations were depicted, they generally followed established cultural patterns that reinforced rather than challenged existing power structures. Medieval European entertainment forms like carnival and folk festivals often included inversions of normal social hierarchies, including gender relations, but these inversions were temporary and occurred within cultural frameworks that ultimately reinforced traditional arrangements. The comedy derived from the temporary nature of the role reversals rather than from depicting actual harm or violence. The development of modern entertainment industries has complicated these traditional frameworks by creating content that reaches diverse audiences with different cultural backgrounds and evolving understanding of gender equality and women's rights. What might have been acceptable within historical entertainment context becomes problematic when viewed through contemporary understanding of gender-based violence and its social implications. The specific scene involving a woman and dynamite in Flight as a Feather apparently crossed cultural boundaries by depicting gender-based violence in ways that contemporary audiences found unacceptable, even within the supernatural comedy framework of The Mask. The details of exactly what was depicted are less important than the cultural response it generated and what that response reveals about evolving standards for gender representation in family entertainment. This cultural response reflects broader shifts in how democratic societies understand the relationship between entertainment representation and social behavior, particularly regarding gender relations and violence against women. Traditional approaches to entertainment evaluation focused primarily on explicit messaging or obviously harmful content, assuming that fictional context provided adequate protection against real-world implications. But contemporary understanding of media influence suggests that representation can affect social attitudes and behaviors through more subtle mechanisms than direct instruction or obvious modeling. When entertainment content consistently depicts certain groups in particular ways, it can normalize attitudes and behaviors that may be harmful even when the content doesn't explicitly advocate for such attitudes or behaviors. This understanding has led to more sophisticated approaches to content evaluation that consider not just explicit messaging or realistic depiction, but also the cumulative cultural impact of particular types of representation. The scene in Flight as a Feather was problematic not necessarily because it was realistic or because it explicitly promoted violence against women, but because it contributed to cultural patterns of representation that could normalize harmful attitudes toward gender-based violence. This cultural normalization concern connects to broader patterns we see throughout history in how successful societies have developed mechanisms for protecting vulnerable populations from harmful social attitudes and behaviors. The most effective civilizations have typically recognized that cultural representation plays important roles in shaping social attitudes and have developed institutions and practices to ensure that such representation serves constructive rather than destructive social functions. The development of legal protections for women and children, for instance, reflects growing recognition that vulnerability requires special consideration in how societies organize their institutions institutions and practices. Similarly, the evolution of understanding about domestic violence and gender-based harassment has led to more nuanced approaches to preventing and responding to such behaviors. The flight as a feather case represents part of this broader historical evolution toward more gender-informed approaches to cultural representation. Rather than simply assuming that fictional content is harmless regardless of its depiction of gender relations, contemporary societies are developing more sophisticated understanding of how different types of representation affect social attitudes toward gender equality and women's safety. But this evolution also creates new challenges for creative expression and entertainment production. As understanding of media effects becomes more sophisticated, content creators face increasingly complex requirements to consider not just artistic merit or entertainment value, but also potential social impact on gender relations and women's safety. This expansion of creative responsibility connects to broader questions about the proper balance between artistic freedom and social responsibility in democratic societies. Traditional liberal frameworks emphasized individual choice and assumed that audiences could make appropriate distinctions between fictional representation and real-world behavior. But contemporary understanding of media effects suggests that such individual choice may be less meaningful than previously assumed, particularly regarding cultural attitudes that develop through accumulated exposure to particular types of representation. The institutional response to Flight as a Feather also reveals important insights about how democratic societies manage cultural content without resort to direct government censorship. Rather than being banned by legal authority, the episode was withdrawn by family channels and broadcasting institutions that recognized its potential for contributing to harmful gender attitudes and chose to remove it from their programming. This self-regulatory approach represents a distinctively democratic mechanism for managing cultural content that operates through institutional judgment rather than legal prohibition. Content creators and distributors make decisions about appropriate material based on their understanding of social responsibilities, audience expectations, and potential consequences of distributing content that might contribute to harmful social attitudes. But this self-regulatory system also creates accountability challenges because the decision-making processes are often opaque and the criteria for content evaluation may vary significantly across different institutions and contexts. Unlike legal prohibition, which operates through transparent processes with clear standards and appeal mechanisms, institutional self-regulation can result in inconsistent outcomes that may not reflect broader social values or expert understanding of media effects. The Flight as a Feather case demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of this self-regulatory approach. The system allowed for quick response to emerging concerns about gender representation without requiring lengthy legal processes or government intervention, but it also meant that decisions about content were made by business executives and institutional managers rather than through democratic processes or expert evaluation of gender studies research. The specific concern about gender-based violence in the episode also reflects broader cultural shifts in how democratic societies understand and respond to violence against women. Traditional approaches to social organization often normalized various forms of gender-based violence or treated them as private matters outside the scope of public concern. But contemporary understanding of gender-based violence recognizes it as a significant social problem that requires collective response and prevention efforts. This expanded understanding has led to new approaches to content evaluation that consider how entertainment representation might contribute to attitudes and behaviors that enable or normalize violence against women. This shift toward gender-informed content evaluation connects to broader patterns we see throughout history and how successful societies have expanded their understanding of human rights and social justice. The development of women's suffrage movements, for instance, reflected growing recognition that gender equality requires institutional changes and social attitude shifts that go beyond formal legal protections. Similarly, the evolution of understanding about workplace harassment and domestic violence has led to more sophisticated approaches to creating social environments that protect rather than endanger women. The Flight as a Feather case represents part of this broader evolution toward more gender-conscious approaches to cultural representation. The international dimensions of the controversy also reveal important insights about how cultural standards regarding gender representation vary across different democratic societies and how global media distribution creates challenges for content regulation. Animated content created for one cultural context may be distributed to audiences with different gender equality frameworks, cultural references, and regulatory standards. This global distribution challenge reflects broader questions about cultural sovereignty and gender equality standards in interconnected media systems. Should content be evaluated according to the gender equality standards of its country of origin, its primary audience, or the most protective standards among its potential global audiences? The Flight as a Feather case suggests that concerns about gender-based violence may transcend cultural boundaries in ways that make universal content standards more feasible than standards based on other cultural preferences. While different societies may have different approaches to gender relations, the basic recognition that violence against women is harmful may be similar enough across democratic societies to support more universal approaches to content evaluation.
The technological context of contemporary media consumption also affects how content decisions like the flight as a feather withdrawal actually function in practice. Unlike traditional broadcast media where institutional decisions could effectively control audience access to content, contemporary digital distribution systems make such control much more difficult to maintain. Content withdrawn from family channels may still be available through alternative platforms, international sources, or file-sharing systems. This technological reality raises questions about the effectiveness of content withdrawal and whether protective efforts might be better directed toward education, labeling, or other approaches that acknowledge the practical limitations of content control. The educational implications of the flight as a feather controversy extend beyond immediate concerns about gender representation to broader questions about how democratic societies should teach young people about gender equality and respectful relationships. Rather than simply protecting children from all potentially harmful representations, educational approaches might focus on developing critical thinking skills about media representation and healthy relationship models. This educational alternative reflects broader debates about protective versus preparatory approaches to gender education. Protective approaches emphasize shielding children from harmful gender representations until they develop adequate critical thinking abilities. Preparatory approaches emphasize teaching children to critically evaluate gender representations and understand healthy relationship dynamics, even when such education requires engaging with problematic content. The flight as a feather case doesn't resolve these debates, but it illustrates how they play out in contemporary media contexts where children may encounter problematic gender representations regardless of official protective efforts. The most effective approaches may combine protective measures for the most vulnerable populations with educational efforts to help children develop critical thinking skills about gender representation and relationship dynamics. The long-term impact of the flight as a feather controversy on animation and family entertainment reveals important lessons about how concerns about gender representation affect creative expression in democratic societies. Following incidents like this, content creators and distributors appear to have become more cautious about including material that might contribute to harmful gender attitudes, even within traditionally permissive comedic contexts. This increased caution demonstrates how concerns about gender representation can create beneficial changes in entertainment content that better reflect contemporary understanding of gender equality and women's rights. Content creators must now consider not just traditional concerns about violence or sexual content, but also more subtle questions about how their representations might affect social attitudes toward gender relations. But this evolution also raises questions about creative freedom and the proper scope of social responsibility in entertainment content. While protecting women from harmful representation serves important social purposes, excessive caution might also limit the ability of entertainment media to address complex gender issues or explore challenging relationship dynamics. The flight as a feather case also illuminates important questions about the relationship between comedic context and social responsibility in entertainment representation. The episode's problematic content apparently occurred within comedic scenarios that were intended to entertain rather than promote harmful attitudes toward women. But contemporary understanding of media effects suggests that comedic context may not provide adequate protection against harmful social implications, particularly when comedy consistently depicts certain groups in problematic ways. Humor can sometimes make harmful attitudes seem acceptable or normal by packaging them within entertaining contexts that discourage critical evaluation. This creates challenges for comedic entertainment that depends on exaggeration, stereotyping, and boundary pushing for its effectiveness. Comedy creators must somehow balance their artistic goals with social responsibility considerations that may limit their ability to explore certain topics or use certain comedic techniques. The case ultimately demonstrates the ongoing evolution of gender consciousness and social responsibility in democratic entertainment systems. As understanding of gender equality and media effects continues to develop, entertainment institutions must adapt their practices to incorporate new understanding while maintaining their cultural and artistic functions. Through the analytical framework we use for understanding power and cultural representation throughout history, the flight as a feather controversy reveals how contemporary democratic societies have developed sophisticated mechanisms for protecting women from potentially harmful cultural representation, while maintaining respect for creative expression and artistic freedom. Unlike historical approaches that often normalized various forms of gender-based violence or treated gender relations as purely private matters, contemporary approaches increasingly recognize that cultural representation plays important roles in shaping social attitudes toward gender equality and women's safety. But the case also demonstrates the ongoing challenges of balancing gender equality concerns with values of creative expression and comedic freedom in democratic societies. The withdrawal of problematic content from Flight as a Feather served important protective functions, but it also raised questions about how far gender-informed content evaluation should extend in limiting creative expression. As democratic societies continue to develop more sophisticated understanding of media effects and gender equality, cases like Flight as a Feather will likely inform ongoing negotiations about appropriate boundaries for family entertainment. Understanding how such decisions are made, what values they reflect,
and what alternatives might be available becomes increasingly important for maintaining appropriate balance between gender protection and creative expression in democratic cultural systems.
The flight as a feather controversy reminds us that even seemingly simple decisions about entertainment content reflect complex negotiations between competing values and evolving understanding of gender equality, social responsibility, and media effects. As our knowledge of these relationships continues to develop, these negotiations will likely become more rather than less complex, requiring ongoing attention to how democratic societies can protect women from harmful representation while maintaining vibrant and diverse cultural expression that respects gender equality and promotes healthy relationship models.